Today's podcast features 3 separate, unique stories that all involve highly dysfunctional families. The audio from all of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Amityville Horror, and it's about a man who did something horrible to his family. The second story you'll hear is called Crossbow, and it's a story about someone who just could not stop lying. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Daddy, and it's about an entire family who more or less lost their minds all at once. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please invite the 5-star review button to come over to your house to play Call of Duty, but when they arrive, give them the NES Duck Hunt remote as their controller. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into our first story called Amityville Horror. On the morning of November 13th, 1974, 6 members of the DeFeo family were asleep in their home in Amityville, New York. The 7th member of the family, Ron, was sitting on his bed in the basement. At around 1 a.m., he gets up off his bed, he grabs a rifle, and he starts walking up the stairs. He goes across the first floor, goes up the second floor stairs, and he gets to the second floor landing, and he walks right into his parents' bedroom, which was totally dark besides this little candle that had been lit next to his father's bedside, and he raises his rifle and he puts 2 rounds into his father's back. And then as soon as his father is still, he aims at his mother and he shoots her 2 times. And then he puts the gun down and he walks out and he goes across the hall into his brother's room. He raises his rifle and he fires 1 shot into his 12-year-old brother Mark, and then he aims at his 9-year-old brother John and he fires 1 shot into him as well. Then he leaves their bedroom and he walks down the hall to another bedroom where he finds his 13-year-old sister Allison. He raises his rifle and he fires 1 shot. He leaves her room, he goes up the 3rd set of stairs up onto the 3rd floor, finds his 18-year-old sister Dawn, and he fires 1 shot into her, and then he was done. Altogether, it took Ron about 15 minutes to massacre his family. At no point was he panicked or running around or acting crazy. He was just walking calmly room to room, taking very well-aimed shots to ensure they didn't get up again. He put the rifle down and he went outside and he jogged to a bar where he went inside and he put on this big facade that he had just found his family and they were hurt and could you come help him? And when they got to the house, he refused to go inside, but the people from the bar went inside and they discovered this horrible scene. And when the police show up, Ron goes over to them and he actually confesses and says, "I killed my family." Even though the DeFeo family had a reputation for being very dysfunctional, it was Ron who had the worst reputation. He was known around Amityville for heavy drug use, for being a total alcoholic, and for getting really aggressive and confrontational with people. He was just a guy no one wanted to be around. And so when news got out in Amityville that this horrible thing has happened, and it looks like Ron is the one who did it, no one was really that shocked. But when details of the crime scene, specifically the way the bodies were positioned, made people wonder, is there more to this case that we don't know about? All of the DeFeo family members had been found lying face down in their beds, and none of them showed any signs of putting up a struggle against their attacker, which led investigators initially to think that they must have been sedated, that Ron must have drugged them somehow before he carried out this attack. But when the toxicology reports came back, no one in the family had any substance in their system. At first, the police did not think that was a very big deal. They figured, you know what? The family just must not have heard the different gunshots. He wasn't shooting lots of rounds. It was, 1 single round here, 1 single round here, that perhaps they just didn't hear it, and that's why no one tried to escape. But it turns out the rifle Ron was using, the .35 caliber Marlin, is one of the loudest rifles you can own. And in fact, investigators went out and did a test with it, and they fired it indoors, and you could easily hear it a mile away. And so investigators said, well, then it looks like they must have heard these gunshots, but for some reason didn't get out of their beds. They didn't try to fight back in any way. They just kind of took it. And then you have the weirdness of Ron's confession. On the night of the attack, when Ron is sitting on his bed and he can't sleep and everybody else is asleep upstairs, he starts hearing a voice in his head that's saying,
"Catch them, kill them."
And he thinks he's just losing his mind. But then out of the shadows, straight across from him, from underneath the steps in the basement, this shadowy figure emerges and starts walking towards him, and he can see what looks like its mouth moving and saying the words,
"Catch them, kill them."
And Ron's looking up at it as this figure walks all the way up to him and bends down and gets right next to his ear. And he says right into his ear,
"Catch them, kill them."
And then Ron said involuntarily he reached over to the rifle that was on the bed with him, and he stood up and he began walking towards the steps. And he knew what was going to happen. He was going to go kill his family, and he didn't want to do it, but he felt like he didn't have any more control over his body. And that's when he realized he was being possessed by this demon in the basement. While Ron's confession terrified everybody in Amityville, the idea that there was a demon living in the basement of this house that possessed someone to go kill their family, that terrified everybody. But it didn't hold up in court, and ultimately Ron was sent to jail for life. 1 year after the attacks, another family, the Lutz family, moved into the house in Amityville. But they left 28 days later because they were hearing voices coming from the basement. After hearing about the mass murder that occurred in the house, and now the Lutz family saying that there's something in the basement, world-renowned demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren, they descend on the property, and very quickly Ed and Lorraine say, yes, this house is definitely haunted. And in fact, to this day, the Amityville house is considered one of the most haunted places in the entire world. Today, the house still stands, and it's been bought and sold a number of times over the years because apparently no one likes to live in this house for a very long time. Our next story is called Crossbow. In 2007, Brett Ryan was a charming 26-year-old man living in Toronto, Canada. He was known as an extremely friendly guy who was always smiling ear to ear with his trademark grin. In his spare time, he could be found at children's hospitals reading to sick kids, or at the community center volunteering as an umpire for Little League baseball games. But behind his seemingly perfect exterior, behind the scenes, Brett was struggling. He had to move back in with his parents after dropping out of college and racking up over $60,000 of debt. While his friends graduated college and went on to begin their careers in medicine and finance and education, Brett was only able to get a job as a part-time house painter. Brett felt like he had a lot of potential that he was squandering, but he felt like the debt that he had racked up was really his roadblock between him and the life he was supposed to have. And so instead of working hard and making some money to pay down his debt, he decided to come up with an absurd get-rich-quick scheme that actually kind of worked. On October 20th of that year, Brett walked into a bank near his home, and he had hospital bandages wrapped around his head and his face, and his left arm was in a sling. Then he walked up to one of the tellers and he handed her a note that just said, "I have a gun underneath this sling, give me $2,000. And the teller very quickly complied, and she gave him a little over $1,000. That was all the money she had. And Brett took the money, turned around, and calmly walked out of the bank. And he got in his car and he got home, and he was totally exhilarated, and he's half expecting the police to just show up at his front door, but they never did. He was never caught. And after that, he was hooked. For the next 8 months, Brett robbed a dozen other banks in the area, stealing almost $30,000. He became so confident in his ability to steal without getting caught that he began dressing up in these ridiculous outfits that included this huge, obviously fake beard. And in fact, the media dubbed him the fake bearded bandit. The reason Brett wasn't getting caught is because the police would get his fingerprints at the crime scene, but because he did not have a criminal record, his prints were not in the database. And so the police basically just had to set up and hope to catch this guy in the act. And in the summer of 2008, they finally would catch the fake bearded bandit. At Brett's trial, dozens of his friends wrote letters of support to the judge, saying that Brett was actually a great guy, that this was a product of desperation, and a total break from his normal character. And some of the organizations that he volunteered with did the same thing, writing letters to the judge saying what a meaningful contributor Brett was to the community. When Brett spoke at his trial, he was incredibly remorseful and said he had allowed his debt to get totally out of control and that admittedly he had not handled it well. And so the judge took all of this into account, all the letters of support and Brett's overall appearance in court, and he decided that this was indeed a break from character and that Brett was actually a very promising young man and that he did not deserve the harshest penalty. And so Brett was sentenced to just under 4 years, which considering the crime was a very lenient sentence. And so Brett went to jail, but then less than 2 years later, in 2010, he was granted parole and allowed to move back in with his parents. And his parents would say he was a changed man ready for a fresh start. But Brett would find life outside of jail was exponentially harder now that he was an ex-con. It was extremely hard to get a job, which meant he had no income, and without an income, he couldn't pay down all those debts he had, and so he had to declare bankruptcy. As for life at home, it was very difficult. Brett's family was very embarrassed about what he had done, and when Brett moved back home, it was obvious that all the neighbors were gossiping constantly about their family. And so Brett and his family actually moved to another Toronto neighborhood just to get away from all of that. But once they settled into this new neighborhood, Brett really knuckled down and decided he was going to get his life together and he was going to do it all on his own. And so he applied to dozens and dozens of jobs all over the place, and finally he was able to get some low-paying work in retail. It wasn't great, but it was a start. And so Brett began working countless hours at this really low-paying job, and his parents noticed how hard he was working to try to get his life back together, and so they decided they would help him out financially so he could re-enroll in college and finish his degree in biophysics. While Brett was in school, he met a woman named Kristen who had a full-time job and lived in this beautiful home, and by and large, she had the life that he wished he could have. And the two of them quickly fell in love, and Brett told her about his criminal past as the fake bearded bandit, and she accepted him, and she didn't judge him, and she said, "I still love you, I still want to be with you." 2 years later, Brett moved out of his parents' house and into Kristen's house, and for once in his life, he felt like his life was going the way it should be. Then, a year later, tragedy struck when Brett's father passed away, and suddenly Brett had to go to his mother's house all the time to try to help her out. And his mother was very appreciative of the time he was spending with her, and so she actually began paying him for the work he was doing around the home. And considering Brett was a broke college student, this was a huge help, and in many ways, it really brought Brett and his mother together. A year later, in 2015, Brett proposed to Kristen, and she said yes. But at the same time, school was getting overwhelming for Brett, and he dropped out. But he was too embarrassed to tell his fiance or his family because everybody thought he was on the right path and he didn't want to explain why he had dropped out, and so he just pretended to still be in school. Then, in the spring of 2016, when Brett should have been graduating, he got a very lucky break when a big tech firm in Toronto offered him a job. On paper, Brett should not have gotten this job. He wasn't qualified. He didn't have a degree. But in getting this job, Brett was able to tell his fiance and his family that he had just graduated college, and that was how he was getting this job. His family and his fiance were a little confused why they weren't invited to his graduation ceremony, but nonetheless, they were very excited for him and they took him out and they celebrated. Then, a week after Brett accepted this job, the tech firm rescinded their offer when they discovered Brett was in fact the fake bearded bandit. Now, Brett panicked because this job represented this perfect piece to his web of lies that allowed him to pretend he had his degree and that everything was so great. And so he couldn't possibly tell his fiance and his family that he didn't get this job. And so he decided he would just lie and pretend to go to this job every day. Meanwhile, Brett's mom began bragging to all of her new neighbors about her son, Brett, who had really turned his life around. He graduated from college, he got this great job, he's got a beautiful fiance, he's got this wonderful home. Everything is just going great for Brett. At first, Brett was able to push the guilt out of his subconscious and just live this ridiculous lie. But as his wedding day approached, the weight of all these lies and the guilt he felt, it became overwhelming. And practically speaking, he was worried about how he would explain to his new wife why he had no income despite having this full-time job. And so he went to his mother and he told her the truth about dropping out of college, about not getting that job offer. And then he said, "Can you keep all of this a secret? And can you give me a whole bunch of money so I can keep living this lie?" And she said, "No. And in fact, you need to tell your fiance that you're lying or I will." This was the worst case scenario for Brett and one that he was not prepared for. He really thought his mom would be like, "Yep, let's do it. Let's keep this thing going." But when she didn't, he didn't really know what to do. He believed if Kristen found out the truth, she would leave him and that would ruin his perfect life. And so he decided he would not tell Kristen. Instead, he would kill his mother. Because he was an ex-con, he couldn't buy a firearm. However, he could buy a crossbow. And so he ordered his crossbow, he watched a couple YouTube videos about how to operate it, and then on one of his trips to his mother's house to help out, he stashed the crossbow and some arrows on a shelf in her garage. Then, when he got home, he began designing these bizarre contraptions that were built out of fans and pulleys and broomsticks that, when turned on, would move around the room and click on his keyboard and turn his phone off and on. It was designed to help him build an alibi when he was out committing murder. His devices would be turning on and off again, giving the impression that he was at home the whole time. On August 25th, 2017, all his preparations were done. He woke up early that morning and he began getting ready for his fake job. At the same time, Kristen was also getting ready for her real job, and then at 7:30, when they were both ready to go, they hopped in their respective cars and headed out for the day. But Brett slowed down at the end of the street and waited for Kristen to disappear around the corner. Brett turned back, went back into his house. He went up to his room and turned on all of his bizarre alibi contraptions that he made sure were turning off and on his devices correctly. And after a while, once he was confident these devices would work, he hopped in his car and he drove over to his mother's house. He got there around 10 a.m., he walked inside and his mother was sitting in the kitchen, and he approached her about changing her mind about telling the truth to Kristen. But his mother was staunch and she said, "No, I'm going to tell her before your wedding unless you do." And so their exchange got really heated, and before long his mother actually called one of his older brothers, Chris, to come to her house and talk to Brett to defuse this situation. Brett was furious and stormed out of the kitchen. He grabbed the door that led into the garage and he stormed in to try to get his crossbow off the shelf. But his mother followed after him. Now, the crossbow had not been loaded when he put it up on that shelf, and Brett was not very good at loading it, and it would take several seconds to actually do it. So he's thinking to himself, when I pull that down and begin loading it, she's going to see the weapon and she's going to run outside before I can get to her. And so when he reached up, he didn't grab the crossbow, he grabbed the arrows. And in a swift motion, he pulled them down, re-gripped them like a knife, faced his mother, and began attacking her viciously. She fell backwards, and a shelf actually landed on top of her, pinning her to the ground. At which point, Brett seized the opportunity. He got up, grabbed a piece of nylon, he wrapped it around her neck, and he suffocated her. As soon as she was dead, Brett pulled her out from under the shelf and dragged her to the side of the garage. He put the shelf back up, and then he began loading his crossbow because he knew Chris, his older brother that his mother had called, was going to be here soon. And so he hid behind the door inside of the garage and just waited. And at some point, he heard Chris's car pull into the driveway. Chris walked into the house. He yelled for his mom. He yelled for Brett, but he didn't get a response. And eventually, Chris made his way to the open door leading into the garage. He stepped inside, and as soon as he did, Brett silently got up behind him, and he fired one shot directly into the back of his neck, killing him instantly. Brett took Chris's body and piled it on top of his mother's, and as he was putting a tarp over top of them, he heard another car pulling into the driveway. It was his younger brother, AJ. Now, at this point, Brett knows he is in too deep and he has to finish the job, and so he doesn't have time to load his crossbow, and so again, he just grabs one of the arrows, and he walks outside, and he sees AJ getting out of his car, and he runs up to him, and he jabs the arrow into his brother's neck. And so they're fighting in the driveway. Meanwhile, Brett's other brother, Lee, who's actually in the house sleeping, he wakes up to the sound of this commotion outside in the driveway. He looks out the window and he sees his brothers fighting. And so he runs downstairs and he comes outside. And at this point, AJ is laying on the ground and he's basically motionless. And Brett is standing over him. And Brett turns and he sees Lee in the doorway and he runs off after him. Lee sees his brother running at him and just turns and runs into the house, but he only gets a few feet before Brett jumps on top of them, and then the two of them have this vicious fight where Brett is trying to stab him with the arrows, and they're basically both fighting for their lives. And at some point, after Lee suffered several very deep cuts, he manages to throw Brett off of him, and he runs outside to his brother AJ, who's now crawled all the way to the street. And in fact, AJ had managed to flag down a neighbor and got his neighbor to call the police. As for Brett, after Lee had managed to fight him off and ran outside, he knew he was done. And so instead of chasing his brother outside, he put his arrow down and he walked into the kitchen. He opened up the fridge. He took a bottle of water out. He left the fridge door open and just walked out to the front steps and sat down and drank his water while he waited for police to show up. When they did arrive, his brother AJ died before they could save him. As police were arresting Brett, he kind of casually said, "Yeah, I should have taken AJ to the hospital. I could have saved him. And the other guys in the garage are dead. Crossbow to the head. It was me." In court, Brett was extremely remorseful and pled guilty to all of his charges. The judge told Brett that he was appreciative of the fact that he was taking full ownership of his heinous crimes, and that in many ways he was a victim too, a victim of this huge web of lies that Brett just couldn't get out from under. But nonetheless, Brett was given 3 consecutive life terms, one for each of the murders he committed. The only surviving family member, Lee, the brother who was attacked last and managed to run outside and escape Brett, he said that his life was shattered that day and that he can barely go outside because of his extreme post-traumatic stress. The next and final story of today's episode is called Daddy. The The Chundawats were a big, tight-knit, middle-class family who lived in a cramped city in northern Delhi, India. For generations, their family had been farmers living and working out in the desert, but in 1989, their beloved patriarch, Bhopal Singh, decided it was time for a change. That year, he sold all of his farmlands and then used the money from that sale to move with his wife and his youngest son to the city. And over the next couple of decades, one by one, the rest of Bhopal's children and their families followed him out there to the city and moved in with him. By 2007, there were 12 Chundawats all living under one roof. They made their living by running a grocery/plywood shop on the first floor of their house. The store was quite prosperous, not only because the goods they sold were top-notch, but also because the locals just really liked being around the Chundawats. Bhopal was this big, friendly personality that took on a sort of fatherly role in the neighborhood, and so locals began calling him Daddy just like his family did. Bhopal's wife, Narayan, took on a motherly role in the neighborhood and so naturally was nicknamed Mommy. When she wasn't taking care of her own family, she'd be outside handing out tea to workers on the street or looking after neighborhood kids. The rest of Bhopal's family, which included his 3 adult children, 2 of their wives, and 5 grandchildren, were also often seen down at the store, and they were highly regarded and respected as well. By all accounts, the Chundawats seemed like very successful and happy people that kind of had a perfect life. But in 2007, they would face a crisis when Bhopal died. Knowing how much he meant to that family, neighbors were concerned that the family would fall apart without him. But surprisingly, immediately following his death, it was like the family started improving in all aspects of their life. It was like an already perfect family got even better. They began working extra long hours at their store, and before long, they had earned enough money to open another store and put an addition on their house. They improved their health by changing their diet and cutting alcohol and tobacco out of their lives. Their children, who were already very gifted students, began studying even more and did even better in school. And the whole family, from the youngest to the oldest, became exponentially more devout. While neighbors certainly noticed these changes in the Chundawats, none of them raised any eyebrows. In fact, people were impressed. This incredible family has managed to come out of a huge crisis better off and happier for it. Little did they know that behind the scenes, something totally sinister was driving these changes. Fast forward 11 years to July 1st, 2018. That morning, like every other morning, locals began lining up outside of the Chundawats' grocery store, waiting for them to open their doors. The Chundawats were known to be extremely punctual, and at 6 a.m. sharp every day, they opened those doors. But this morning, 6 a.m. came and went, and the store stayed dark and the doors stayed closed. People began calling the Chundawats, but none of them had their phone on. And so eventually, a 79-year-old neighbor decided they would just walk up the steps to the Chundawats' house and check on them themselves. And so up they went, they knocked on the door, they yelled out for the family, but nobody came to the door, everything was off. And so eventually they just tried the doorknob and twisted it, and it turned. He swings it open and he yells out the family's name, and as soon as the door flings open and he can see inside, he nearly faints. He backpedals, he screams, he runs down to the street, and he yells for someone to call the police. Luckily, there was a police officer in the area, and so very quickly they came over and they cleared the crowd out of the way that was forming at the base of the Chundawat steps. They were all looking up to see whatever this neighbor had seen. And before the officer actually ascended the stairs, someone told him what was seen inside of the house. And so he's mentally preparing himself for what he's about to walk into. He walks up the stairs and he pauses right before turning the corner when he's going to actually see inside the house. He takes a deep breath, he knows what he's going to see, he turns the corner, he walks inside, and he's still completely shocked at what he's seeing. He would only be able to stay inside of the house that first trip for about 10 seconds before he too turned around and ran out of there. He would say it was just too much, it was one of the worst things he had ever seen, and that he hopes he never has to see anything like that ever again in his career. Eventually, the police would go back inside the Chundawats' house, and after looking around, they would find 11 hidden diaries. And in these diaries would be the full, awful story of what happened to that family. In the first few days following Bhopal's death in 2007, the family called a priest to lead them in a prayer honoring their lost loved one. And during this prayer, Lalit, who was Bhopal's youngest son, at the time he was in his 30s, he began chanting. And as soon as he did, the rest of his family stopped what they were doing and just stared at him. They couldn't believe what they were hearing. A few years earlier, Lalit had been in this horrible accident where plywood had fallen off of a shelf and hit him in the head, nearly killing him. He survived the ordeal, but the damage to his head left him unable to speak. But now, here he is chanting and speaking. And so as his voice grew stronger and stronger as he was doing this chant, the other family members just continued to watch him and listen to him, and then they began whispering to each other, "Daddy has returned." Following this prayer session, Lalit kept his voice, and he began keeping a diary, the first of the 11 he would ultimately fill. The first few entries in that first diary were fairly normal. They were just reflections on his day or on his life, but pretty quickly, the entries took a major turn. The first strange entry occurred on September 7, 2007. To that point, Lalit had been writing in kind of narrative format about his life and whatever it was he was writing about, but it just kind of abruptly stopped, and in its place was this really deliberate instruction for his family. It said they all needed to get a black and white photo of Bhopal, their patriarch, and put it in front of them, and then pray they're able to rid themselves of their old habits. From this point onward, the diary entries became more frequent, and they stayed in this kind of strange instruction format for the family. It was like it was a growing list of rules for the family to follow. And the tone of these instructions that Lalit is writing out in this diary became more and more aggressive and punitive and hectoring. It was like the family was being punished. But the family appeared to obey all of these instructions. And this was because Lalit told his family that Bhopal had come back from the dead, he had given Lalit his voice back, and he had spoken to Lalit and explained to him that the reason he was back is because he wanted to save his family's souls. Lalit explained that at night, Bhopal would possess his body, and then using Lalit's body, he would write these instructions in the diary for his family to follow. And the idea was, if you follow these instructions, that will set you on the path to saving your soul. His instructions were at first just simple ways to honor Bhopal, but quickly they became really specific directives of how each of the family members needed to live their life on a day-to-day basis. There were instructions about which food they were allowed to eat and when they were allowed to eat it. There were instructions about which things they could sell in their store, and there were instructions on how to invest their profits, and there were countless instructions on how they should be praying and when they should be praying. Every night, just before 9 p.m., the family was instructed to stop whatever they were doing and head back to the house, and if anybody asked them what they were doing, they were supposed to tell them that grandfather was coming. And so they would all convene in a room inside of their house, and they would wait, and then at some point, Lalit would walk into the room, he would sit down in front, and then right at 9 p.m., he would become possessed by Bhopal, and then Bhopal would lead a 15 to 30 minute long prayer. Eventually, Lalit began observing a vow of silence, and he told his family that if and when you hear my voice again, it's not Lalit, you're only hearing Bhopal. In the eyes of his family, Lalit was no longer Lalit. Lalit had become Bhopal, or I guess Bhopal had become Lalit. But either way, Bhopal was back, and so with the exception of Lalit's mother, everyone in his family began referring to him as Daddy. Over the years this went on, the neighbors did pick up on the family's strange behavior, specifically Lalit's strange behavior. But no one ever said anything about it because despite the weirdness, the family seemed like they were really flourishing. They looked healthier, they were making more money, the grandchildren were excelling in school, and they just generally looked really happy. And so fast forward to June of 2018, which is the month before the neighbor and then police officer sees this horrible thing in the Chundawat household. That month, June, was an especially happy time for the Chundawat family because one of the grandchildren had announced they were going to get married. And so on June 17th, they have this huge engagement party. The whole family's there. They're dancing for joy about this incredible announcement. And then they began shifting their focus to planning this wedding that everyone is so excited about. A couple of weeks later, on June 29th, the Chundawats had their neighbor over for dinner, and that neighbor would later say that nothing seemed amiss, and over dinner, all the family wanted to talk about was this incredible wedding they were planning and how excited they were to go to it. And this wedding was several months away. Less than 48 hours after this dinner, the Chundawats failed to open their grocery store, and so the neighbor goes up the stairs, he opens the door, and he sees 10 members of the 11-person Chundawat family dangling from nooses in the front hallway. They were hanging very close together in a circular pattern that looked very intentional. Their hands and their feet were bound. They were blindfolded with strips of cloth. Their mouths were taped shut and their ears were packed with cotton balls. On the ground underneath them were black stools that had toppled over. The 11th and final member of the Chundawat family, which was the 77-year-old widow of Bhopal, was found dead laying in a bed nearby with a belt right next to her. The initial thought by police is this was a mass murder, but after reading the last few entries of Lalit's final diary, they realized it wasn't. Lalit had convinced his family that just abiding by Bhopal's strict instructions that he gave them in the diary, that was not enough to save their souls. What they needed to do was participate in a ritual he was calling Vat Tapasya, which means worship at the hanging roots of the banyan tree. 8 days before their bodies were found, the family, who agreed to do this ritual, began practicing for it. And every night they'd work on binding their hands and their feet and then unbinding themselves, and they would tie nooses and put it around their neck, and they would tighten them, and then they'd loosen them and take them off, and they'd do it to each other until they were very good at doing all of those things. The day before their bodies were found, the family performed what's called a hawan, which is a ceremony of burnt offerings. And then afterwards they ordered food and then tied their dog up outside. At 10 p.m., one of the grandchildren and her mother left the house and went to a store and then were caught on camera walking back to the house carrying these black stools that they would later use in the ritual. Just after midnight, it was time for the family to get in position. The parents helped their children put on their bindings, they got them up on their stool, and they put their nooses around their neck and cinched it down tight and told them to wait. And then afterwards, they did the same thing to themselves. At this point, Lalit's mother most likely realized she was not able to climb up onto the stool because she was hurting or she was tired, and so a decision was made to move her into the bedroom. And so she, along with Lalit and Lalit's wife, Tina, walked into the bedroom, and once she was laying down on the bed, Lalit put a belt around her neck, and then he and Tina pulled on it until his mother went still, and then afterwards he took the belt off, put it next to her, and then Lalit and Tina casually walked back towards the front hallway, where the 8 other family members were now in position. They're blindfolded with cotton in their ear, they have their noose on, they're just waiting, and Lalit and Tina walk around the room, kicking their stools out from underneath them. And while their family slowly asphyxiates all around them, Lalit and Tina bind up their wrists and their ankles, they get on their stool, they blindfold themselves, they tape their mouth, they put cotton in their ears, they put their nooses on, they cinch them down, and then they both jump. The very last line in the final diary that Lalit kept, it says, "Keep water in a cup. I will appear and save when color changes." This ritual was supposed to allow the family to see Bhopal in person. Lalit told them that as soon as they were hanging, the skies would open up, the earth would tremble, and Bhopal would walk right into the room and save them from their death. And they were going to be able to prove that he was there, because not only would they have lived through this ritual, but also Bhopal was going to change the color of the water in the cup that was left out near their bodies. The family had even left the front door unlocked to make it even easier for Bhopal to come in and save them. The Chundawats were not committing suicide. They believed they were going to survive this ritual. This is why just 2 days earlier at that dinner with the neighbor, they were eagerly talking about this wedding that was off in the future they were planning because they believed they would get to attend it, even though they knew in 2 days they'd be performing this Vat Tapasya ritual. Ultimately, investigators closed the case as a mass suicide, citing the cause as shared delusion. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the 5-star review button to come over to your house to play Call of Duty, but when they arrive, give them the NES Duck Hunt remote as their controller. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen Podcast on Amazon Music, because starting November 1st of this year, 2022, our podcast is only going to be available on Amazon Music. However, from now until November 1st, you can still get the podcast on all platforms. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crimes. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. But the real reward is helping to create a new ending to the story for victims of violent crime. Go to mrballen.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast features two separate, unique stories that are both themed around the same thing: family secrets. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from my YouTube channel and has been remastered for this episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called The Most Terrifying Family You've Never Heard Of, and it's about an obscure cult who admitted to performing a heinous ritual in the 1970s. The second story you'll hear is called Someone in This Family Has a Secret, and it's about a family in Ohio who started noticing some very strange people lurking around the outside of their house at night. Both of these stories contain graphic content, but it is the first story about the cult ritual that needs a special warning. It contains extreme graphic violence and sexual content. As such, listener discretion is advised. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to curl the 5-star review button's hair for their wedding, but then repeatedly touch the top of their ear with the curling iron. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into our first story called The Most Terrifying Family You've Never Heard Of. In the early 1950s, Harold Alexander, who was a young stonemason living in Hamburg, Germany, came in contact with an old man named George Reel. George was the leader of a small religious group called the Lorber Society. This group, which never had a large membership at any point in their short history, was rooted in the Christian faith, but their views were far more extreme than the average Christian congregation. For example, many Christians believe in the concept of self-denial, which in layman's terms means to deny oneself some personal human pleasures, like certain sexual practices or the overindulgence of food or drinking, and all of this is done to gain favor with God. But George and the other members of the Lorber Society took this concept of self-denial to the extreme. They practiced it so aggressively and so literally that nobody in the society could really have a life of their own. All they could do to adhere to their society's very strict rules was to worship God 24/7. In addition to their very severe lifestyles, members of the Lorber Society also believed that anybody outside of their small society was basically evil. So Harold meets George. It's unclear exactly how he meets George, but he does. And immediately Harold is blown away by George. He thinks he's totally incredible. He's so charismatic. And apparently George felt equally highly about Harold. And so right away they have this friendship, they strike up, and Harold and his wife Dragma, they end up joining the Lorber Society, and they completely give themselves over to this very intense lifestyle, and they listen to everything George tells them to do. And then very quickly after Harold and his wife had joined this society, their leader, George, became very ill, and it became clear he was going to die soon. When George was on his deathbed, Harold went to visit him, and after speaking with him privately in this room, Harold emerges and he tells his wife that George has told him that he is going to be the next leader of the Lorber Society once George passes away. And so his wife accepts this, as does the rest of the society members, and then after George actually does die, everyone in the society just turns towards Harold and begins listening to him and following him. It's worth noting that we don't know for sure if George really did tell Harold that he was going to be the next leader of the Lorber Society, or if Harold just made that up because he knew George was going to die soon and he could kind of get away with stealing that title. Over the next few years that Harold was in charge of the Lorber Society, he began introducing a new concept to the members. He would continuously tell them that they needed to be ready for when the next prophet of God returned to the earth. Harold told his members that when this happened, 1, Harold would know immediately and he would tell them, and 2, whatever this prophet wanted, no matter how confusing or crazy or terrible, they had to do it without question because this was God's will. In 1953, so roughly a year or two after Harold has taken over the Lorber Society, he and his wife, Dragma, have their second child. It's their first boy, and they name him Frank. And as soon as this child is born, Harold looks at him and determines that this boy, his son, is the prophet they have all been waiting for. And so he tells his wife and he tells the members of the Lorber Society that his son, Frank, is the prophet of God, and everyone across the board completely accepts it. As the prophet, Frank, grew up, he was shamelessly worshipped and waited on 24/7 by the members of the Lorber Society and his own family. And so naturally, this had a profound impact on the way Frank thought and how he behaved. By the time Frank was at the age of grade school children, he fully believed that he was the prophet of God, and he began using that authority to kind of boss his family around more than he really needed to, especially his 3 sisters and his mother. But no one ever intervened because, again, this is the prophet of God and he can do whatever he wants. When Frank turned 16, he started thinking about girls and sex, but he was conflicted because he had been taught everybody outside of this society he was a part of were evil. And so he didn't want to pollute himself by having sex with these evil women. And so he went to his father and told him that he wants to start having sex with his mother and his sisters in order to stay pure. And his father, Harold, not only embraced the idea, he encouraged it. And in fact, he would often join in with his son during the sexual intercourse. As for the 4 Alexander women, they completely accepted their new roles as sexual objects because they believed by doing whatever Frank the prophet wanted, they were serving God. Eventually, one of these sisters began talking to some of her very few friends at school about how she was kind of jealous of her other sisters for all the attention they were getting from Frank. And so the friends kind of picked up on this strange relationship between the siblings, and before long, rumors had started about there being some incestuous relations inside of this family, and those rumors eventually made their way to the parents of students, and then from the parents, that made its way to the police, and before long, Harold had discovered that the Hamburg police were about to launch an investigation into his family. And at the same time, Harold also discovered that members of the Lorber Society, they had heard about these incest rumors as well, and they had their own suspicions already, and they were not on board with incest. And so they were very clearly starting to distance themselves from Harold and his family. And so it was pretty clear to Harold that the writing was on the wall. He and his family were no longer welcome in Hamburg. And so he goes to the Lorber Society and kind of retires and says, I'm leaving. You need to find yourself a new leader of this society. And then he and his family completely broke ties with the Lorber Society. They left Hamburg and fled south to Santa Cruz, which is a city on the Canary Islands in Spain. And so they settle into this little apartment inside of this busy city, and very quickly they fell back into their old routines of constantly worshiping Frank, the prophet of God, despite the fact that they were no longer affiliated with the Lorber Society, and so their actions were now being driven by their own personal belief system. 10 months later, on December 22nd, 1970, a wealthy doctor named Walter Trankler was at his villa, which was located not far from where the Alexanders lived, when he heard a knock at his front door. When he opened the front door, he saw there were these 2 men who he didn't recognize, who were covered head to toe in what looked like mud. And at first, he was totally taken aback by their appearance and almost wanted to just shut the door. But in order to be polite, he kept the door slightly open and said, hey, how can I help you guys? And the 2 men would introduce themselves as Harold and Frank Alexander, and they were there to speak with one of their family members, Sabine. Sabine was one of Frank's 2 younger sisters, and she worked for the doctor as a housemaid. And so the doctor, he didn't know any of Sabine's family members, so he just kind of took their request at face value and said, hold on, let me go get her. And so he leaves the front door, he goes into the kitchen, and he finds Sabine, this 15-year-old girl, and he tells her that your father and your brother are waiting for you outside, they want to talk to you. And so Sabine, without saying a word, puts her knife and the food down. She walks out of the kitchen with the doctor, and as they're walking towards the front door, the doctor stops about 10 or 15 feet away from the front door to kind of allow Sabine to walk up and have a semi-private conversation with her relatives, although they're still inside of his house, so he didn't want to go too far. And so the doctor is standing maybe 15 feet away, wondering if he should just turn around or maybe just go into the other room to let them speak, when he overhears the father, Harold, say something truly horrific to his daughter. It was so shocking that the doctor stopped what he was doing, turned, and looked directly at Sabine to see how she was going to react to what she just heard. But to the doctor's absolute shock, Sabine didn't break down and start crying or start screaming out in pain or anguish. Instead, she reached out and grabbed her father's muddy hand and pressed it to her cheek and said, "I'm sure you did what was necessary." And then the 2 embraced. The doctor stood there totally shocked, staring at these people, wondering what the heck they're doing. Why are they here? What are they talking about? Is this really happening? And then he just kind of blurts out, "Hey, I'll be right back. Stay right there." And then the doctor turned around and darted out of the front hall into another room where he barricaded himself inside, and then he called the police. When the police showed up just a few minutes later, they rolled into the front lot and they saw Harold, Frank, and Sabine were still just casually standing in the front doorway of the doctor's villa, seemingly not really trying to go anywhere or do anything. And so the police get out of their car, they walk up to the trio and they say, "What's going on? What are you doing here?" And Harold very calmly and casually tells one of the officers the same horrible thing that the doctor overheard him saying to Sabine. Except this time, Harold specified to the officers where this horrible thing took place. He said it happened inside of their apartment. The police were shocked at Harold's candidness and the fact that his two kids were standing right next to him and they're hearing what their father is saying. They too are just totally detached and very calm, as if nothing their father is saying is having any effect on them. It's just totally business as usual. And so the police asked Harold to repeat the story a few times to make sure they were hearing him correctly, and then they just arrested Harold and his two kids. After the three Alexanders were brought to the police station, 3 other police officers were sent over to the Alexanders' apartment in Santa Cruz to see if what Harold had said was actually true. And when these officers opened the front door to that apartment, they immediately could tell it was all true. The following is the story of what happened inside of that apartment based on the testimony given by Frank and Harold. On December 21st, 1970, so that's one day before Frank and Harold arrived on the doorstep of the doctor's villa, the father and son were home in their apartment with the mother, Dragma, as well as 2 of the 3 sisters. It was 18-year-old Marina and 15-year-old Petra. The other sister, Sabine, she was over at the doctor's villa. She was staying with him for a couple of days while she worked there. At some point that afternoon, Dragma and Harold left the living room and went into one of the bedrooms to lie down and take a nap. And after they lie down, Frank, for some reason, gets up from the living room and walks into the bedroom and sits down on the edge of the bed and just stares down at his mother. And when his mother rolls over and looks up at her son, Frank would later tell police that the look she gave him was suggestive and it was offensive to Frank, and he believed she was not permitted to look at him that way. And so in this moment that she's looking at him, he said he instinctively knew that the killing hour was upon them. The killing hour was not a Lorber Society concept. It was something that Frank and most likely Harold had come up with, and the rest of the family, the mother and the 3 sisters, had totally accepted. According to Frank and Harold, women were impure, and the only way to purify them, i.e. send them to heaven and not hell, was to murder them. And so it was just fundamentally understood in the Alexander household that at some point, Frank was going to declare that the killing hour was upon them. And when that happened, all the women in the household were told to stop what they were doing and wait for Frank to sacrifice them. Meaning, wait for Frank to ritualistically kill them. So after Frank has seen this offensive look on his mother's face, he now feels like the killing hour is upon them, and so he literally announces it to his mother and to his father, who's right next to her, and then Frank grabs a nearby wooden coat hanger and strikes his mother on the top of her head. Now, his mother, she's heard that the killing hour is upon them, and he's starting to beat her, and so what does she do? She follows the rules. She flips herself over onto her stomach, puts her hands down by her side, and lays flat and still so Frank can more easily kill her. And so Frank begins wailing on the back of his mother's head with this wooden coat hanger, while his father, Harold, excitedly leaps out of the bed, doesn't try to stop what's going on. He runs into the living room and he begins very enthusiastically playing the organ. An organ is like a piano that's played a lot of times inside of Christian churches. And so with all this commotion going on in the house, the other 2 sisters that were there, Marina and Petra, they come out of their bedrooms into the living room. They see their father playing the organ, and they look into the bedroom where they hear all this noise, and it's Frank murdering their mother. And they're looking at this happening. They're not doing anything. They're just staring at it. And then their father says to them, "The killing hour is upon us. You need to get ready." And so the girls, when they hear this, they know the rules. And so they stop watching this attack, and they make their way over to the center of the living room, and they sit down cross-legged, and they begin to patiently wait their turn. After a while, Frank stopped beating his mother, who was now unconscious or perhaps even dead, and he walked out of the bedroom into the living room where he saw his father on the organ and he saw his two sisters sitting on the ground. And so without any hesitation, he walks over to Marina, the older one, the 18-year-old, and he begins hitting her on the top of the head until she slouches over onto the ground motionless. And then he turns to the younger one, Petra, the 15-year-old, and he does the same thing to her until she's laying on the ground motionless. After this, Frank stands up and he leaves the living room and goes into the kitchen where he retrieves a small knife, pruning shears, and a hammer. At this point, it's likely that one or two of the Alexander women were still alive. And so Frank, he comes back into the living room with these tools in hand, and with the organs blaring in the background, he begins to systematically hack off the breasts and genitals of his two sisters and his mother. And apparently this was a very slow and physically difficult task, and so he and his father Harold began switching off. One person would be on the organs while the other was mutilating, and they would switch back and forth until all of the offending parts on these three women had been removed and nailed to the wall. The last mutilation this father and son committed was to cut the heart out of the mother, Dragma, and they wrapped it up in a cord and then nailed this cord to the wall as well. Then, with the three Alexander women either dead or close to death, the father and son began running around the apartment, yelling and singing and rejoicing. They were extremely proud of what they had just done. Later that night, they left the apartment and slept in another property that they owned. And then the following day, December 22nd, they went to the doctor's villa to tell Sabine the good news. And so they knock on the door, the doctor answers, he goes back and gets Sabine. Sabine walks up, and Harold, her father, says to her, "Sabine, we wanted to tell you right away that Frank and I have just finished killing your mother and your sisters." To which Sabine walks up to him, takes her father's hand, presses it to her cheek, and says, "I'm sure you did what was necessary." This, of course, is what the doctor saw and overheard that was so horrible and prompted him to call the police. It was also the moment when he realized that was not mud all over these two men. That was their family members' blood. Psychiatrists would ultimately determine that Frank and Harold were not mentally fit to stand trial, and so they were both committed to an asylum for the criminally insane. Both men never showed any remorse or regret about what they had done. In fact, they continued to justify their actions by saying, because of them, these three women got to go to heaven. As for the one surviving daughter, Sabine, she pleaded with authorities to let her go live with her brother and her father in this asylum, but they rejected this request and sent her to live in a convent, which is a building that nuns live in, and no one really knows what happened to her after that. Shockingly, in 1990, so roughly 20 years after Frank and Harold were put into this asylum, they managed to escape, and they were never caught. To this day, their whereabouts remain unknown. The next and final story of today's episode is called "Someone in This Family Has a Secret." Strongsville, Ohio used to be just another typical quiet American suburb. Nice homes, nice families, nice restaurants, and a mall. But in late 2017, a discovery was made in Strongsville that put this town on the map in the worst way possible. To understand this discovery, we need to go back to early 2016 when this town's nightmare began. In early 2016, two longtime Strongsville residents, Bruce and Melinda Pleskovic, received some very exciting news. Their 20-year-old daughter named Anna and her 20-year-old fiancé named Jeff had just told them they were expecting a baby girl. And so Bruce and Melinda were totally excited about the prospect of finally becoming grandparents, but at the same time, they knew Anna and Jeff did not have very much money. Anna still lived at home with Bruce and Melinda. She did have a job, but she made very little money. She was a waitress at a local Applebee's restaurant. And as for Jeff, he had a better job working as a service technician for a heating and air company, but he didn't have enough money to support him and Anna. In fact, he didn't even have enough money to move out of his parents' home. He was still living with them on the other side of Strongsville. And so this couple, they're really excited about their baby, but Bruce and Melinda are thinking, we really got to find a way to support them because they are just not prepared for this first child. And so Bruce and Melinda, they talked it over and they decided the best way to support this young couple was to tell their daughter if she wanted to, she could invite Jeff to come stay at their house. That way the two of them could be together, and once they had their daughter, Bruce and Melinda could be the great-grandparents and help take care of the baby. And in general, this would allow the couple to just continue to save money and move out when they were ready. And so when they told Anna they were willing to do this, Anna was so happy, she was so grateful. She called Jeff, and Jeff was equally happy and grateful and said, yes, I would love to move in with you guys. So it took several months, but finally in June of 2016, which was the same month that Jeff and Anna welcomed their daughter to the world, Jeff would leave his parents' home and move into Bruce and Melinda's home. And almost immediately after he moved in, he and the rest of Anna's family began experiencing some very strange and disturbing things around their property. Just a few days after Jeff had moved in, he and Anna were home alone. They were on the main floor of the house and they were having dinner at the kitchen table. And at some point, Jeff just happened to glance out one of the back windows that looked out into their backyard. And now this property had this huge sprawling backyard. Basically, they had all these houses kind of in a row, and they all had almost like a communal backyard, this big open space. And so Jeff is looking out into this huge backyard, and he sees off in the distance something strange. He doesn't really know what he's looking at because it's nighttime, it's dark, but he stands up and he walks over to the window, and as he's looking out, he sees way off on the backside of their property are these four strangers just standing there, appearing to be smoking something, and they're just kind of looking up at the Pleskovic house. And so Jeff is looking out the window at these four, not really sure what to make of them, and he calls Anna over, and so Anna walks over, and the two of them are looking out, not really sure what to do. I mean, on the one hand, these four people who they clearly didn't know, or they believed they didn't know, were definitely trespassing, but at the same time, they weren't really doing anything. They were just kind of standing there smoking. But as they're watching these four people, one of them begins walking up the property towards their home and then stops alongside the Pleskovic trampoline, which was in their backyard. And this person begins fiddling with the trampoline. And so at this, Anna's like, you know what? I don't know what they're doing. I feel totally uncomfortable. And so Anna would actually call the police. And so the police, they come out, but by the time the squad car arrived in front of the Pleskovic house, the four people in back must have seen the car and they took off running. And so when the police officer went in the backyard and looked around, there was no one there, and there was also no sign they were there. There was no dropped cigarette butts or anything. They just kind of vanished. And so the police officer told Jeff and Anna, if they come back, let us know. And so the officer left. And then a little while later, when Bruce and Melinda came home, Jeff and Anna would tell them about what happened, and they would agree that that was totally strange, that in all the decades they had lived in Strongsville, they had never had anybody stroll onto their property and just loiter in the middle of the night. And so for the next couple of days, the family was definitely on edge, but after a little while, this whole incident was largely forgotten about. Fast forward about 5 months to November 2016, and Anna was home alone with her young daughter, and she's playing with her daughter on the first floor of the house towards the front of the house. And as she's playing with her daughter, she suddenly hears what sounds like someone trying to open the back sliding glass door on the back of the house. And so instinctively, Anna thinks, okay, Jeff must be out there, or my parents must be out there, and they don't have a key or something. And so she scoops up her daughter, and she begins walking towards the back of the house to open this door for them. And when she walks into one of the back rooms, before she reaches the back door, she happens to look out one of the windows that looked out into the backyard. And standing right up against the glass is this unknown male figure with his face pressed up against the glass. And so Anna just freezes and stares at this guy, and then this guy, he notices Anna and he ducks down out of view. And now Anna's thinking to herself, this is the guy. He must have been trying to break in my back door. I'm home alone. I don't know what's going on here. I don't know if he's going to try to break in again. And so she just turns and runs back towards the front of the house. She runs upstairs. She goes in a bedroom. She locks the door and she calls the police. But by the time the police come out there and they look around, they can't find this unknown figure that was at the back of the house, and there's no sign of an attempted forced entry. And so unfortunately, they told her, look, I'm sure this was very traumatic for you, but there's really nothing we can do here. There's no evidence to suggest who did this. And so please just, keep your house locked. And if you see anybody suspicious on your property, call us back. And so naturally, after the police left and Anna had a chance to contact Jeff and her parents, they were horrified and they rushed home to comfort her. And then after the initial shock of this incident had worn off, the family began to speculate, do you think this might be connected to those four strangers we saw on our property a few months ago? It just seems odd that those two things would happen so close together. And then the family began to think, okay, well then who is this person? Who are these people? What do they want? Why are they targeting us? What's going on? Because as it was, the Pleskovic family, they didn't have any enemies, at least none that they knew of. If anything, the people of Strongsville adored this family, especially Melinda, the mother. For the past 20 plus years, she had been a middle school teacher in town and her students adored her. She was also a big-time soccer coach in the community because she had played in college and she was still very passionate about it. So she was this amazing coach. And in the eyes of many parents in the Strongsville community, Melinda was a bit of an inspiration because she was not only the mother to Anna, she was also the mother of an 18-year-old boy named Kyle who had Down syndrome and was nonverbal. And Melinda just had this unbelievable way with him where she was so good to him. She incorporated him in everything. She got him so involved. She gave him the best life he could possibly have. And so anytime you saw Kyle with his mother, Kyle would be all smiles. Even though Kyle couldn't speak, it was so obvious his mother made him incredibly happy. But regardless of the reason for these strangers to be lurking around their property, the Pleskovic family was now totally on edge and found themselves constantly looking out the windows, especially at night, in fear these strangers were going to come back and might try to break in again. And unfortunately, these strangers would come back. In January of 2017, so 2 months after Anna saw that unknown figure at the window and heard the back door sliding around, Bruce's car was broken into. It was sitting in the driveway of their property. Someone got inside of it and stole his laptop. And so Bruce, he calls the police and he says, I've got to believe this has to do with the people that are harassing my family. And the police believed him and they began looking around and asking around, but they could never track down the laptop or the thief. And so once again, the family was kind of left on their own. And the police said, look, if you see anything else, let us know, but there's not much we can do here. A few months later, in July of that year, Anna, Jeff, and their daughter were all home together one night when Anna happened to look out one of the back windows on their first floor, and out on the very back of the property were 3 strangers just standing in that same spot where they saw those 4 strangers smoking the year before. And these 3 strangers are just standing there looking up at the house. And so horrified, Anna calls out to Jeff and says, look, there are 3 people in the back of our property. And so Anna, she pulls out her phone and she's calling the police. And as she's calling the police, Jeff, who's totally upset that there are these people harassing him and his family and making them feel unsafe, he just grabs a flashlight and storms out the back door to go confront these people. But as soon as Jeff went out the back door, before he could even shine the light on them, the 3 people had turned and ran and vanished. And so finally, when the police did show up, they were aware of all the calls they had gotten from this family. And so they went out there and they did a serious search for these 3 strangers. But like always, nothing was found. And so the family once again was told, if you see anything else, let us know. The following month, which was August, Anna was home with her daughter, along with her mother, who was upstairs. And as Anna is in the front of the house in the playroom with her daughter, she hears the sound of somebody trying to open that back sliding door. And now immediately her radar is up because she knows what happened the last time she heard the sound. There was that person in the window. But she's thinking, okay, I can't just immediately call the police. I need to at least look and see if there's someone that I know at the back door. And so she scoops her daughter up, she stands up, and she walks around to the edge of the room she's in, and she kind of peeks her head down this hallway that will give her a clear view of this backsliding glass door. And once she finally has a full view of whoever is there, she screams because there are 2 large adults, as she would say, standing at the back door trying to force open this door. And so when she screams, these 2 strangers, they hear it, they turn around and they run. And Melinda, she was upstairs, she hears her daughter screaming, she comes flying downstairs, she's trying to figure out what's going on. Anna is hysterical, the baby's crying. And so Melinda actually calls the police about what her daughter has just seen. The police come out, they search the property, they can't find anyone. And so again, the police leave and they tell the family, look, I'm sorry this is happening to you, but we can't do anything. So please just let us know if anything else happens and we'll be out here as soon as we can. We're bound to catch these people, but right now we just don't have much to operate on. The following month, which was September, one of Melinda's car keys would go missing. And whoever had these keys, whoever had stolen these keys, would use it to randomly start Melinda's car in the middle of the night. And they also used it to set off her car alarm at odd hours of the night. And then also during this time frame that her keys were missing, they also discovered that there were nails jammed into the tires of Bruce's car. And so, of course, the family calls the police and tells them about what's going on, but the police can't do anything. And so very frustrated, Melinda actually takes to Facebook and posts that someone's stolen her keys and please just give them back. And just overall, she's pleading with whoever is harassing her family to just leave them alone. But unfortunately, this post would not do anything. The harassment would continue. A month later, on October 19th, Jeff was home alone when he heard the sound of the backsliding glass door rattling, and now he knows that every time this has been heard by Anna, that there's always some stranger at the back door. And so Jeff grabs the family dog and he very carefully turns and looks down that hallway towards the back door to see who this is, and right as he pokes his head out, he sees there's this large adult figure with a hood up trying to open this back door. And so the dog sees this person and starts barking and running towards the door. Jeff runs after the dog, and this big person outside who's trying to break in, he sees the dog, he sees Jeff running, and he turns and he runs away. And so Jeff and the dog, they stay inside the house and they watch this guy just take off across the property and disappear into the trees. And Jeff would call the police, but like always, the police came out and there just was nothing they could do. 4 days later, on October 23rd, Jeff, along with his young daughter and Bruce, they went to the local Applebee's where Anna worked to have dinner there and have Anna wait on them. And then after they were done eating, they said their goodbyes to Anna, they left the restaurant, they hopped in their cars, and they drove back to their house. When they got there, Bruce was the first up the steps, and he got to the front door and it was locked, and so he knocked. And Kyle, his son, he came and unlocked the door. Bruce went inside, followed closely behind by Jeff, who was holding his daughter. They get inside, and Bruce walks through the house to the back of the house where the kitchen is. He flips on the lights, and there's something on the kitchen floor. And when Jeff sees it, he immediately turns around and runs out of the house carrying his daughter. He grabs Kyle along the way and just takes them straight out of the house. And then once Jeff was outside, he called 911. And when you listen to his 911 call, it sounds like Jeff is unable to process what he has just seen.
911, what's the address of your emergency?
Somebody's been attacked in my house.
Somebody's been what?
Attacked.
They attacked who? Who was attacked?
Mel Pleskovic. Mel Pleskovic was attacked.
He was attacked by whom? Do you know?
She was. No, we just came home. She's on the kitchen floor.
Jeff and Bruce had just discovered Melinda lying on the kitchen floor. She'd been stabbed over 35 times and shot 3 times. She would be rushed to the hospital, but she would die that night. Although the family was in shock and couldn't even begin to process what had just happened, they were all acutely aware that whoever had done this to Melinda had to be connected to all of these strange and suspicious people that had been lurking around their property for the better part of 2 years. In fact, literally after Jeff had called 911, Bruce was inside in the kitchen kneeling next to his dying wife, and he called 911 and he would tell the dispatcher that the Strongsville Police Department really dropped the ball.
911, what city is the emergency in?
Please come to 1 Blazing Star. I think my wife's dead. We've had people breaking into our f***ing house,
Sir.
and now someone killed her.
Sir, tell me the city you need to talk to.
Strongsville, Ohio.
Okay, you need to be transferred. Don't hang up.
911, what's the city of your emergency?
Strongsville, Ohio. We have people on the way already.
What's the address?
4 Blazing Star. I think someone killed my wife.
You think someone killed your wife?
Yeah, it looks like
Okay,
she has stab wounds on her back. We've had people trying to break into our house all year. Stealing.
Sir, I need to ask you questions, okay? Are you there right now?
I just got in the door with my new son-in-law. My son Kyle was here
Okay,
with her.
sir, what I want you to do is walk out.
The Strongsville Police Department would come out in force for this case, and they would solve it in just 4 days. And when they went public with who killed Melinda, no one could believe it. Back on October 23rd, so this was the night Melinda was discovered, Jeff, along with his young daughter and Melinda and her son Kyle, they were all together in the house, and at some point, Jeff had put his daughter down in her playpen and then went into the kitchen where Melinda was, and he walked up to her, pulled out a knife, and stabbed her over 35 times. And then when Melinda fell to the ground, Jeff drew a gun and shot her 3 additional times to make sure she was dead. Now, while he was doing this, his daughter is literally just a few feet away, and Kyle, presumably, is also right nearby, but he has no way of understanding what's happening to his mother. And so with these 2 totally innocent lives just right nearby, Jeff would clean off his weapons and he'd take off his bloody clothes and he would hide them inside of his car, and then he would just scoop up his daughter and he would leave the house, leaving Kyle alone in the house with his dying mother in the kitchen, just leaves him there, shuts the door, locks it, and then Jeff and his daughter would drive to Applebee's to have dinner with Melinda's husband and her daughter. And then after several hours, when they got back to the property, Jeff knew what was waiting for them inside, and he still allowed Bruce to go inside first and discover his dying wife on the kitchen floor. Very little is known about why Jeff did this, because Jeff has actually never come out and given his motive for the crime. The running theory is that Jeff actually was not going to be able to pay for the wedding, which was coming up in a couple of days, and the wedding venue had actually contacted Melinda and said, hey, we're canceling the wedding because your future son-in-law can't pay for it. And so Melinda apparently confronted Jeff about his financial troubles, and the theory is he snapped and killed her. However, that can't possibly be the entire story for why he did this, because it would turn out Jeff was found to be responsible for literally every single suspicious event that had taken place around the Pleskovic property leading up to the attack. Meaning every time they had seen strangers lurking around their property or people trying to break into their house, that had been because of Jeff. Either it was literally Jeff outside being one of these suspicious people, or he had asked friends or hired someone or groups of people to pretend to be suspicious people on the property, or Jeff had been the only person to see these suspicious people, and then miraculously when other people attempted to look outside, they were gone. And so obviously Jeff was lying. And so I actually had the opportunity to speak with one of Jeff's childhood friends who was actually living roughly in the Strongsville area when this horrible murder took place. And what this person told me is that what is kind of generally accepted as why Jeff did this, according to the people in Strongsville, is that Jeff apparently loathed Melinda. Even though she had opened her house to him, he loathed her. And as soon as he moved in 2016, he began plotting to kill her. And so all of these suspicious events were Jeff's attempt at building this really intricate alibi that they had these strangers out there that were targeting this family, and so that when she would ultimately be killed by him, it would look like these strangers had done it. And at first, it totally worked. Everybody believed, the police, the family, friends, that strangers had broken into the house and killed Melinda. In fact, there was so little suspicion on Jeff after her murder that Jeff actually served as a pallbearer in Melinda's funeral. But ultimately, the police would discover the knife and some bloody clothes in the back of Jeff's car, and so they would arrest him and they would present this mountain of evidence against him, and Jeff would confess to killing Melinda. However, he wouldn't give any additional information about the crime. He would just basically say, yes, I did kill her. He would also never give an apology or explanation to the family. He would ultimately be sentenced to life in prison with the opportunity for parole after 33 years. During Jeff's trial, there was this totally heartbreaking moment when Bruce, Melinda's husband, spoke. And he would say their son, Kyle, does not understand that his mother is gone. And so now, every time they go out to eat, which is something Kyle really likes to do, and he used to love doing with his mother, he'll just sit and stare out the window, eagerly expecting his mother to show up any minute. But of course, she never does. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to curl the 5-star review button's hair for their wedding, but then repeatedly touch the top of their ear with the curling iron. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast features 2 stories about dysfunctional families. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Morning Routine, and it's about one of the most brutal true crime cases we have ever covered.
The second story you'll hear is called Lost Cause, and it's about a 70-year-old man who made a shocking confession on Reddit that quickly went viral. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please deliver a strange, dark, or mysterious story to the Amazon Music follow button, but in PDF format. Okay, let's get into our first story called Morning Routine.
In November of 2004, 52-year-old Peter Porco and his wife, 54-year-old Joan Porco, were like so many other middle-aged, middle-class Americans. They lived in Del Mar, New York, in a comfortable two-story home, and they worked for a living. Peter was an appellate court clerk, and Joan was a speech pathologist. They had been married for over 30 years, and they had 2 sons. Christopher was a 21-year-old student at the University of Rochester, and his brother, Jonathan, was a 23-year-old naval officer stationed at a submarine base in Groton, Connecticut. On Monday, November 15th, 2004, Peter woke up to start his typical Monday morning work routine. He got up, he got out of bed, he went to the bathroom, he relieved himself, he looked in the mirror, he shaved, he got dressed in his work clothes, he went downstairs, he put on a pot of coffee. While the coffee was brewing, he unloaded the dishwasher and then put the dirty dishes into the dishwasher and started it. He wanted to get his newspaper, so he went outside, he got his newspaper, but he realized he locked himself out of the front door, so he got the spare key out from underneath the mat, opened the front door, went inside, he sat down, had some coffee, read the newspaper. After a few minutes, he put his coffee cup in the sink, he packed himself a lunch in his lunchbox, and then he headed for the door to head for work. Peter was known as a very reliable employee who was also very punctual and rarely missed work. So when he didn't get to work that Monday morning, the court was a little bit confused. They called him to see if he was okay. He didn't pick up, so they dispatched a court officer to go make sure he was okay. And so the officer arrives at his house, he sees cars in the driveway, the front door's shut, he goes up, he knocks on the door, nobody answers. He tries the handle of the front door, he realizes it's open, so he opens the door, and he yells out, "Hey, I'm just looking for Peter," and the door hits something on the ground. Pokes his head inside and looks down, and there on the ground, the thing blocking the door, is Peter Porco's body. He's clearly deceased, and he clearly has a massive head wound. The court officer steps outside immediately, calls 911, local police show up, they go inside, and sure enough, Peter is dead. They go upstairs and they find his wife, Joan, in bed, also with a massive head wound, but she was still alive. Joan was rushed to a hospital where she underwent emergency surgery and then was put into a medically induced coma. Meanwhile, the police began their investigation into who could have done this. They quickly discovered that the home's alarm system had been smashed, and a phone line, because there still was landlines at the time, had been cut from the outside, and a screen in one of the windows had been slashed that looked like the way someone climbed into the house. However, nothing appeared to have been stolen because police almost immediately found Peter's wallet with money inside of it still sitting in the house, as well as very expensive jewelry that belonged to Joan still sitting in the house. As they continued to search the house, they discovered a fireman's axe that belonged to the Porcos hidden inside of one of the bedroom closets, and it was very clear this was the murder weapon. The Porco sons had been away during this attack. John was on his submarine in Connecticut, and Chris was at the University of Rochester, and in fact, Chris found out about the attack on his parents when he saw a news report. Because this story of this innocent, typical-seeming American couple in a quiet suburb getting struck down by some axe-wielding maniac had gone totally viral, and it was all over the news. And so Chris called the police to get more information about his parents' death. Here's the recording.
Hi, my name is Chris Porco. I was just called by the Times-Union saying that my parents were found dead this afternoon. I was wondering if you had any information for me.
Hey, Chris, whereabouts are you?
I'm at school in Rochester, New York.
Okay, you're in Rochester?
Yes.
Okay, and you're hearing from the Times-Union?
Yeah, they said my parents were found, I guess, I don't know, they didn't say how or anything.
So you will be here probably, you're going to go right to Albany Med?
I don't know, I don't even know where my mom is, but...
Yeah, she is at Albany Med.
Okay, do you know her condition?
No, because I haven't talked to her. Let me give you my pager number.
As you can tell, Chris is extremely emotional. He's beside himself. He can barely speak. He's so upset about what's happened to his parents. No, actually, he sounds as calm as if he's ordering a pizza. because Chris Porco was actually a psychopath, and he was the one who attacked his parents with the axe. As it turns out, Chris was failing at school and taking out huge loans in his father's name by forging his signature, and his father found out about it. So Mr. and Mrs. Porco write their son a strongly worded email where they tell him this behavior has to stop, and they're very disappointed in him, but they love him and they will help him get back on his feet. Chris responded by driving home in the middle of the night, sneaking into his house and attacking his parents with an axe. While this case is already disturbing and horrific and tragic, it's what happens to Chris's father after the attack that makes it one of the most brutal cases of all time. After being struck 16 times in the head and laying unconsciously in his bed as his son snuck out of his house, Peter suddenly sat up and began his morning routine. He got dressed, he went to the bathroom, he shaved, he went downstairs, he made coffee, he did his chores, he went outside to get the newspaper, he got locked out, he got the key from under the mat, went back inside, he packed his own lunch. When he was finally ready to go, he headed for the door and then he collapsed and he died. Due to the severity of Peter's head wound, his brain was basically broken and it was unable to recognize he had been gravely injured. So in his final moments, he believed it was just a typical Monday morning going about his work routine, when in reality, he had a gaping head wound and he was basically dead after the 16th blow to his head. One of the more surprising and heart-wrenching details of this case is that Joan Porco, she did survive the attack. And after she came out of that medically induced coma, she said she forgot all the details of the attack, even though when she was discovered in her bed, she did indicate that Chris, her son, was the attacker. Nonetheless, she got together $250,000 to post Chris's bail, and she allowed him to come stay with her during his trial. And the two attended the trial together, walking into the courthouse hand in hand. Chris was very quickly found guilty of killing his father and attempting to kill his mother, and he was sentenced to 50 years to life in prison. Despite the verdict, Joan Porco still speaks to Christopher over the phone and frequently visits him in prison. It's unclear if she still believes he is innocent.
Our next and final story is called Lost Cause.
On the advice of his longtime therapist, a 70-year-old man named Art began writing about what happened to him and his family 30 years earlier in 1989. His therapist only knew Art had lost a child and felt very guilty about it, but the conditions under which the child was lost was always very gray. Even though Art had been his patient for years and the therapist had repeatedly tried to get more information. Was this a child that was lost in pregnancy? Was it a child that was born and died or ran away? Those details never emerged, and every time the therapist tried to dig in, Art would back off, close up, and he would not talk about it. And so finally, his therapist said, Art, you just need to find a way to talk about this stuff. If you're not going to talk about it with me, then perhaps you should write it all down in a private journal. It'll be a very cathartic experience, and it might help you get over that guilt you're feeling. So Art reluctantly agrees. He goes home, he gets out a piece of paper, and he begins writing all the details of everything that happened leading up to that day in 1989 and what actually happened on that day in 1989. And when he was done and he had a chance to look at what he had written, he didn't feel better. He felt worse. He felt more guilty. But that's because Art had a secret that the therapist didn't know about. And now that it was out on paper, Art suddenly felt like, you know what, before I die, I have to tell the world what me and my wife did. So in 2019, he took all of those notes that he had written down about what had happened, and he posted it to Reddit. This is his confession story. Art's son was very, very troubled. Art would say, if you've seen the movie, We Need to Talk About Kevin, where a couple's son turns out to be a total psychopath, Art says that's a pretty good representation of what home life was like with our son. From the day Art's son was born in 1971, it was like something was off about him. Art and his wife Lisa had planned this pregnancy, and they were ecstatic when their baby boy was welcomed to the world, and they showered him with affection and love and did everything they possibly could to give him a warm, loving environment. But no matter what they did, it just seemed like he was always miserable. Their son cried constantly for the first 13 months of his life. Now, Art and Lisa understood that when you bring a baby home, there's a good chance they're going to cry. But his crying was so constant, and he could not be calmed down, that they grew concerned that this was more than just a colicky baby, that there could be some underlying issue. And And so they brought their son to doctors and specialists, and they tried every treatment under the sun. They changed his diet, they changed his room, they sang him songs, they changed everything they could, but it never stopped. And so 13 months of grinding, grating, no sleep hell. Finally, in the 14th month of his life, he seemed to get over the incessant crying stage, and Art and Lisa were so relieved. It seemed like finally they could just be loving parents and not be so frustrated with their child all the time. But it seemed like now that he wasn't crying, he still was just totally unhappy. His body language and everything about him said, "I'm not happy," always. Art said that he never saw his son ever have a genuine, joyous smile. The only time he saw something resembling a smile was when his son would grin after causing someone pain or breaking a rule or in some way being bad. And then once his son started walking, all he wanted to do was just destroy everything in front of him. But again, Art and Lisa, they realized that this is all pretty typical child behavior, albeit maybe on the more extreme end of bad behavior, but it's still in the realm of normal child. And they're thinking that they are the reason this is happening. And so they're not blaming their son at this point. They're still doing everything they can to take care of him and love him to the best of their ability. When their son was about 2 years old, he learned how to take off his diaper, and he began sneaking around the house and emptying the contents of his diaper into corners of the house, underneath carpets, grinding it into the carpet, smearing it on the walls. But again, Art and Lisa are looking inward and saying, our child is only 2 years old. It can't be his fault he's acting this way. It's our fault for not finding a way to correct this behavior. But Art and Lisa started to drift away from that opinion when their son got a little bit older, got potty trained, and wasn't using diapers anymore, and still was going around the house and squatting down and going to the bathroom all over the house, making a mess at every possible chance he could. And not just when he was 4, 5, 6 years old. All the way up until he was 15 years old, he was doing this. And he stopped doing it in random corners, and he began only going into his parents' bedroom every chance he got, opening up the sheets, going inside, going to the bathroom, shutting it back up, and leaving. It got to the point where Art and Lisa literally could not stop their son from doing this. He was absolutely determined to do this. So anytime they were away, he would even sneak in the windows to do this. I mean, he was totally hell-bent on going to the bathroom in their bed. And so they had to start putting locks on the windows and the doors of their bedroom. But when they had finally secured that room to where he really couldn't get in anymore, he began going to the bathroom right outside their door and in the other beds in the house. And so they began investing in locks on all of the doors. They even replaced the doors themselves because they were too flimsy, and they thought there's a good chance he might kick these doors in to try to get them open. So they put these big, thick doors up all through their house and put these big locks with key locks all over the house to keep their son from going in and going to the bathroom all over their bed sheets. As their son grew older, he became more and more unmanageable, well beyond just going to the bathroom in different places. He became violent, and he would bite and kick and scratch and spit on anybody that came near him. He was like a wild animal. Before he was 9 years old, he had been kicked out of school 2 separate times. And they let him back in a 3rd time. He apparently did something that was so bad that they effectively expelled him. A 9-year-old is getting expelled from school. So they had to enroll him at this other special school that would accept him with his history. But part of the deal with this school is you don't have any interaction with other students. He was considered too dangerous to be around other kids. So he was totally isolated at school, and it ultimately made him a lot worse. Once he was enrolled in the school, he became really violent at home. He would come home from school and he would go right to the kitchen and get a knife out, and he would start threatening his parents, to the point where they had to lock all the drawers in the kitchen. Once all of the knives were under lock and key in Art's house, his son began stealing knives from the neighbor's house, smuggling them back into the house, and at night he would pull them out and try to stab Art. And on 2 different occasions he was successful, and Art still has scars on his leg from it. And Art's son was not just attacking his parents. He was also turning on local animals that were helpless. He blinded one of the local dogs that was running around the area by just stabbing it in the eye one day. He went after one of the stray cats and he lit its tail on fire. And honestly, Art doesn't even know the other damages he had done to other animals or even other people. Even though Art and Lisa massively resented their son for how badly he treated them and how difficult he was making their lives, they recognized that this was a child that needed help. And so they tried everything they could to help him by enrolling him in that special school that ultimately was isolating, but it was an attempt to try to help him. or bringing him to different therapists and psychologists and doctors, putting him on different medications and bringing him to meditation consultants. I mean, you name it, they tried everything they could to try to help this kid, but nothing worked. He only got angrier and angrier and got bigger and stronger and more aggressive and violent. And eventually Art and Lisa are like, what do we do about this? What ultimately started happening over the following years is Art and Lisa became prisoners of their own home, that every time their son was around, they felt unsafe around him. He was such a wild card and he had these crazy angry outbursts and he was clearly prone to extreme violence. And so they began using those heavy doors and locks to lock themselves away from their son. It was the only way they felt safe. And so with that in mind, fast forward to 1988 when Art's son is now 16 years old and Art and Lisa find out they're pregnant again. It was a surprise and they were not happy about it. In fact, because of how badly it had gone with their son, they were really scared that another child was going to be just as bad and they couldn't possibly go through this again. And so they decided that they weren't going to terminate, but if they noticed early on this child was a huge problem child, as horrible as they felt about it, they knew they would give it up for adoption. They simply couldn't do this again. This time they had a daughter and she was normal. She was nothing like their son. She didn't come home and cry constantly. She smiled and laughed, and after a few months she was sleeping through the night and she was hitting her milestones and she just seemed happy and she was easy. And it was around this time that Art and Lisa began to realize just how bad their son was. Seeing how wonderful their daughter was just amplified all of their son's atrocious behavior over the first 16 years of his life. And so Art and Lisa really began to look at their son as more of a lost cause. And they were less invested in going through the motions to try to find some way to help him when they knew it wasn't going to work. It had never worked. And he's only a couple years away from being 18 and he can go out on his own and figure it out for himself. And now, since they didn't really care as much about him, suddenly his behavior was intolerable. And anytime he acted up, they would never lay a hand on him, but they were not afraid to tell him to basically get the F out of here. We are not putting up with this. Leave. And so regularly, Art and Lisa would have these horrific screaming matches with their son until their son would basically run away in a rage and then come back hours later or even a couple days later. And Art said he began to look forward to fighting with his son because every time they fought, it meant his son would be gone for a little while afterwards and there would be a little bit of peace and calm inside the house. But at the same time, Art and Lisa were concerned one of these days he's going to come back in after one of these fights and he's going to kill us. So it went on like this for about a year until a rainy day in 1989 when their son was almost 18 and their daughter was almost 1 year old. Now, the house they lived in was a single-story bungalow, and their daughter's room was against a sidewall where there was a window leading to the outside. That morning, Art and Lisa had got into one of the worst screaming matches with their son they had ever had, and he left in a rage, and they slammed and locked the door behind him. After a couple of hours, their son is still gone, and they don't expect to see him anytime soon, and their daughter is starting to get fussy, she seems tired, and so they walk into her bedroom, they put her in her crib for a nap, and then Art and Lisa leave her room, shut the door behind them, and go sit down in the kitchen. A couple minutes later, they hear their daughter screaming at the top of her lungs, and Art and Lisa immediately recognize this is not an ordinary cry. This sounds like something is terribly wrong. They get up and sprint down the hall to a room, and they try the door handle, but it's locked. They run back out to the kitchen, they get the keys, they go back, they're fumbling with the keys, they finally open it up, and there in the back of the room, standing next to the crib, is their son. And he's holding a knife, and he's poking it into her face. And Art said he looked at his daughter and he could see blood on her stomach and blood on her arm, and she's screaming, and so he thinks to himself, thank God she's still alive. And instinctively, Art starts running to try to put himself between his son and his daughter. But before he could even get there, his wife had moved much faster, and she charged over and smashes her son's hand. The knife falls to the ground. She pushes him as hard as she possibly can, and he goes slamming into the wall and falls on the ground. Art immediately reaches into the crib, picks his daughter up, and runs to the other side of the room. And he kind of looks her over. She's crying, she's in pain, she's scared, but he can see the cuts on her are superficial. He turns back around and he can see his wife is standing there with her fist balled, standing in front of her son. Her son stands up and he's looking at her, no emotion on his face. Art would even say that it was like he was looking at an alien. This person wasn't human. How could they do this to their own sister, to a baby? And he stared at him, and then he noticed his wife was moving towards her son like she was going to attack him. And this is where Art says he knew he was supposed to go over there and stop whatever was about to happen. But he didn't. And this is the part of the story where Art reveals his wife, she's this amazing boxer, and he knew that she could beat the living crap out of just about anybody. The son is so stunned by how quickly this has happened that he's not doing anything. He's not positioning himself to fight back or to even preemptively attack his mother. He's just kind of standing there looking at his mother with no expression on his face. And that's when Art's wife winds up and blasts him across the face, knocking his head back. And Art said immediately he could tell his nose was broken, blood squirts all over his face, and he falls to the ground. Until this moment, neither Lisa nor Art had ever laid a hand on their son. Even when he stabbed Art twice in the legs, they never physically struck their son. But this was different. Their son had crossed the line and he could never come back. And so even though Art knew if he doesn't step in, his wife is going to beat their son to death, even though he knew that was going to happen, he remembers thinking, good. He turns around and he leaves the room with his daughter. As Art cleans up his daughter and puts band-aids on each of the cuts that were inflicted on her, he hears in the other room his son is yelling and screaming at their mother saying, I'm going to kill you. And she is just ruthlessly punching, kicking, and smashing him. Just not slowing down at all. And Art remembers by the time he picked his daughter back up, after putting all her band-aids on and she'd kind of calmed down, he still heard his wife punching, kicking, and smashing their son, who's now unconscious. Again, Art knows if I don't go in there now, my unconscious son is getting his head kicked in by his mother. If I don't go in there now, he's gonna die, for sure. But Art wants that to happen, so he doesn't go in there. Instead, he just rocks his daughter until she falls asleep. And by the time she's snoring in his arms, his wife is still punching, kicking, and smashing their son, who hasn't made a sound in a long time. Art just sits down at the kitchen table, hoists his daughter onto his shoulder, and just listens for his wife to finish what she's doing. And finally it does go quiet in there, and his wife emerges from the room, and she's covered in blood, her hands are swollen and red, and her chest is heaving like she's been running a race. She comes into the kitchen and sits down at the table next to Art and looks at him, and he looks back at her, and he just says, is he dead? And she says, I hope so. And he just goes, yeah, me too. Art and Lisa sat at the kitchen table for a long time. There was no sound coming from the room where their son was. And eventually Lisa starts crying and goes and takes a shower. At which point Art stands up and he goes into the bedroom where his son was. And this is when he can tell his son is actually still alive. He walks in and he can see his son still breathing, but he's covered in blood. He's got vomit on him. He's clearly wet his pants. His teeth have been knocked out. His whole face is bloodied and bruised and swollen. And he goes up to him and he thinks there's no way he's going to live through this. But Art has kind of an internal crisis because he wants him to die. He doesn't want him to live. And so that decision of should I call an ambulance or should I call police was a really difficult one to make because really neither served the purpose that he or his wife wanted. And so as he's standing there wondering what to do, he hears his wife come out of the shower. And so he leaves the room and he confers with his wife and they decide, we're not going to call the police. We're not going to call an ambulance. We're going to do nothing. And so right then and there, they walked around their house, they gathered up a couple things, and they headed downstairs into the basement where they had an in-law suite, which basically was a little apartment that they didn't really use, but it had everything they needed. And they moved down there, and they locked the one door that led down there, and they locked the side door as well. They figured if he lived, there would be enough food to get him through a few weeks upstairs. There's water up there, bedrooms, bathrooms. He had all of that. And at some point, he would run out of food, and he would have to leave. Or he would die upstairs, and in a couple weeks, they would go up and they would deal with it. Over the next week, they began to hear movement upstairs, which signaled to them he was alive, but he wasn't moving around much. It was just enough to know somebody was up there. They figured that, okay, he's probably laying down most of the time recovering. And so Art began going back to work. He would go out the side door, and every time he went outside, he was on the driveway, he was expecting his son to come out and attack him, but he never did. And his wife, Lisa, she stayed with their daughter 24/7, stayed in the house, and at no point did the son ever try to come downstairs and try to attack her or them at any point, probably because he was afraid of his mother. About 3 weeks after the attack, they were in bed in the basement and they heard him going absolutely ballistic upstairs, screaming, punching walls, breaking things, and they decided, you know what, whatever he does up there, it's not worth going up there and confronting him. Let him do whatever he wants. And then the next day, it was totally quiet. And for the next couple of days, Art and Lisa would listen really intently to see if they could hear him moving around upstairs, but they couldn't. And so finally, Art and Lisa decide to go up into the main floor and see if he's up there. When they open the door, they find their entire upstairs has been absolutely wrecked. Every piece of furniture is ruined, every window's broken, there's glass all over the place, there's brown smears all over the walls, but their son isn't there. And so they figured that night when they heard him going crazy upstairs, he already knew he was going to leave. He just wanted to ruin their house before he did. Even though their son was gone, they had no idea if he was going to come back or not. And so for days and weeks and months, they lived in fear that their son was just going to show up one day and kill them. But he never did. And then 3 years after the incident, they moved and they weren't in contact with their son. They hadn't seen him. And so he had no idea where they were going and they have no way to contact him. So that was it. They just restarted somewhere else. Fast forward to 2019 when Art is making this Reddit post and he says, I haven't seen my son since 1989 and I don't want to see him again. And Art goes on to say that while he hopes his son was able to overcome his demons and live a normal life, he said if he wasn't able to do that, if he was out there still causing pain and misery to other people, Art says he hopes that whoever was on the receiving end of that finished the job and killed him.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please deliver a strange, dark, or mysterious story to the Amazon Music follow button, but in PDF format. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. We have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation that honors and supports victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballen.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. If you want to check out our merch, join our Discord server, or just see what's going on at Ballen Studios, head on over to our brand new website, ballenstudios.com. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Hello fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. I'm here today to tell you all about what it actually means now that we've moved over to the SiriusXM family. Big picture, it means we are going to make more content for you. Right now, you get one YouTube video a week on Saturday. Well, what we're going to do now is we're going to have the Saturday upload be the same, but then also the MrBallen Podcast. Well, we've begun already filming those episodes like a YouTube video. So that's a second piece of content every week. Then there's 2 other shows that you guys don't even know about yet, which means on any given week, you could have up to 4 new video pieces of content on the MrBallen channel. And also, all these pieces of content will double as podcasts as well. This new content schedule is going to start early next year. Also, there's one other thing I want to clarify, which is the state of MrBallen's Medical Mysteries and Redacted. Those shows were created in collaboration with Wondery, but now we're partnered with Sirius, and so we're not going to be making any new episodes of either of those shows. For now, if you want to hear my podcast episodes 1 week early and ad-free, make sure to subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. Keep on the lookout for more announcements in the coming weeks. Thank you. In today's story, a family uncovers a secret on a laptop, and after that, everything spirals completely out of control. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right show because that's all we do. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the follow button lets you look through their prized 1970s family photo album, make sure you aggressively lick your finger and flip the pages each time so you smudge all the edges. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the night of January 3rd, 2008, a 21-year-old man named Part Engel had just poured himself a beer and sat down on the couch next to his girlfriend to watch some TV when he heard a knock at the front door of his apartment in Pottstown, Pennsylvania. It was late, around 8 p.m., and Part was not expecting any company, and so before he got up, he looked over at his girlfriend to be like, "Are you expecting anybody?" And she looked at him and kind of shrugged, and so Part just put his beer down and stood up and walked over to the front door to see who was there. And when Part opened up the front door, he was very surprised to see his mother standing there carrying a small duffel bag. So Part's mother lived in Middletown Township, which was located about an hour and a half away from Part's apartment. And while it was not unusual for Part's mom to stay over at Part's apartment, what was unusual is her just showing up unannounced. She never did that. And on top of that, as Part is looking at his mom, he could see clearly she had been crying, because her eyeliner was smudged and her face was all puffy, and so Part knew clearly, there must be a problem here. But when he asked his mother, "What's going on, Mom?" she wouldn't tell him. She would just say, "I have to stay with you for the night." And then before he or Part's girlfriend could do or say anything, his mom just walked inside, walked down the hallway, went into the guest bedroom, and then shut and locked the door. And so Part and his girlfriend were left looking at each other like, what's going on here? 3 hours later, at 11 p.m., Part was in bed next to his sleeping girlfriend, just staring up at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Part was so anxious about whatever was going on with his mom because where he was staying, his bedroom, was right next door to the guest bedroom where his mom was staying, and so he already knows there's clearly some issue here with his mom, but all night he's been listening to her next door, just pacing and crying in this guest bedroom, and he has no idea what's going on. But deep down, Part knew that whatever was going on, it very likely had to do with his father, whose name was Arun Kumar. Part's parents had a complicated relationship. They had immigrated from India decades earlier and had settled in Pennsylvania, where they had 2 kids, Part and Part's sister. Part's father, Arun Kumar, worked as an engineer at Boeing, and Part's mother owned a 7-Eleven franchise. And basically, since arriving in America, the 2 of them had really come with nothing and had worked their way up to now to where they had a very comfortable life, kind of like the American dream, the house, the white picket fence, the kids, the whole thing. And so Part had always believed that, his parents, as a result of getting through so much hardship together, that they must truly love each other now. I mean, to have gone through all that together, that would certainly make 2 people very close. And for the most part, that actually seemed to have been the case, that his parents just got along great and were a great couple. That is until a couple of years earlier. Arun Kumar had started an affair, and Part's mother had caught him. Now, Arun Kumar said that, this affair meant nothing and he would stop right now, and Part's mother had forgiven him, in order to keep the family together. But despite Part's mom forgiving Arun Kumar, deep down, she just knew she could never actually trust him again. And so she actually wound up enlisting Part's help to basically watch Arun Kumar's behavior. She had Arun Kumar set up the software that basically spied on Arun Kumar's computer. Through this software, Part's mom could basically watch Arun Kumar's email traffic and all of his internet activity. Now, Part had not felt good about setting up the spy software on his dad's computer. It just felt totally wrong to be getting in between his parents like this. But he just felt like this was the only way Part's mom was ever going to be able to actually move on, and so Part sort of felt like this was his responsibility. This is the way that the family was going to stay together. His mom really just needed that extra layer of transparency on her husband, otherwise the family was going to fall apart. But now, as Part lay in his bed, unable to sleep, listening to his mom pace back and forth in the room next door, he began to think to himself, maybe my mom found something using the software on my dad's computer. Maybe Arun Kumar had started another affair, and that was why his mom was now so upset. But just then, Part heard a new noise coming out of his mother's room. At first, it kind of sounded like low murmuring, like his mom was saying something to herself, but then he realized his mom was having a real conversation with somebody on the phone. And since Part couldn't sleep, and he was pretty intrigued about what the heck was going on with his mom to begin with, he decided to basically spy on his mom. So he very quietly got out of his bed and he walked around to the wall that lined up against his mother's room, and he put his ear to the wall and he began to listen. And what he heard was far worse than anything he could have imagined. What he heard his mom saying to whoever she was talking on the phone was that she had discovered that Arun Kumar had taken out $3.6 million in life insurance policies on Part, on his sister, and on his mother. And now Part's mom was saying to whoever she was talking to on the phone that she wasn't even worried about divorce at this point. She was worried about the physical safety of her and her kids. She was worried that her husband was going to kill her and her kids to get this payout. And so not long after saying this, Part's mom hung up the phone and went back to pacing and crying in the room. And Part, meanwhile, has just heard this horrifying news, and he had no idea what to make of it. I mean, he knew his dad was not a good husband. But the idea that his dad would want to hurt his wife, or him, or his sister, just seemed totally impossible. But then, as Part's standing there just kind of processing what he's heard, he began to think back to these recent behavioral changes he noticed in his father that at the time he had kind of chalked up to, maybe my dad's stressed or something. But now, given the context of what his mom was talking about, Part began to wonder if these behavioral changes were a sign of something being terribly wrong with his father. The first change that Part had noticed happened a few weeks earlier. Now, Part's dad was normally a very mild-mannered and calm guy, but a few weeks earlier, he had gotten into this vicious dispute with their next-door neighbor over the property line that ran between their two properties. It was like he was picking a fight with the neighbor or something. And then, a few days after that, one of the bathroom sinks in their house had stopped working, and so Arun Kumar got out his tools and went to go break apart the sink and put it back together again, and because he was an engineer, this was something he did, this was typical behavior. But after breaking apart the sink, basically ripping it all apart and having all the parts on the ground, Part's dad didn't put it back together. He just left all the tools and all the parts just scattered across the bathroom floor. And considering that Arun Kumar was typically incredibly meticulous and organized, and he's this brilliant engineer, to Part, seeing his dad leave this sloppy mess and this unfinished sink, it felt totally off. And so standing there in his bedroom, totally horrified about everything he's heard, and, now kind of second-guessing everything he knew about his dad, who suddenly seemed like this combative, kind of disorganized guy, Part suddenly felt like, I have to learn more here. I have to figure out if my dad really is a threat. So Part quietly left his bedroom and made his way to the kitchen where his laptop was, and he loaded up that software that spied on his dad's computer. And as he began logging into this program, Part was thinking, maybe I'm going to find something that will show that my mom is clearly just overreacting and misinterpreting what she's seeing, that, my dad is not, out to kill us for some insurance payout. But after loading up this program and kind of scanning through some recent activity, Part realized that actually the situation with his dad was way worse than his mom had made out on that call he overheard. He not only found all these multi-million-dollar insurance policies taken out on him, his sister, and his mom, but also he discovered this stash of fraudulent-looking paperwork. There were all these passport photos of his father, but then connected to these photos was a passport application that was using somebody else's name, as if his father was trying to forge paperwork to create a phony passport for himself. And so at this point, Part felt like his mother was certainly not overreacting here, that in fact it really did seem like his father was, preparing to kill his family and collect millions of dollars in insurance money, and then using this, fake passport he was making, he'd be able to flee the country. For the next several days, Part's mom stayed at Part's apartment, but she barely ever left the guest bedroom. And then when she would leave the bedroom, Part would go up to her and try to ask her, hey, what's going on, without giving away how much he knew already. But Part's mom was like, nope, I don't want to talk about it. And she would just go right back in the room, shut and lock the door. And so finally, after several days of this, Part just went to his mom's bedroom door, he knocked on the door until she answered, and then before she could kind of shoo him away, he said, Mom, stop, I know what's going on, I read the emails, and we have to figure out what we're going to do, because our lives literally depend on it. I agree with you, it looks like Dad is going to kill us and then flee the country. And so Part and his mom would talk through all the details of what was found on his computer, and ultimately they would decide that Part would be the one to go to police and tell them what was going on with Arun Kumar. And so the next day, Part went to the police station, with a stack of evidence that he believed would implicate his father. And, Part was so nervous about this, he was shaking. But when he talked to an actual police officer, they looked over his evidence and they heard the whole story. But they told him, look, we really can't do anything about this. They told Part that, it's not illegal to take out life insurance policies on your family. And then also the police officer pointed out that in addition to Arun Kumar taking out those policies on his kids and his wife, he had also taken out a policy on himself and made his wife and his kids the beneficiaries of that policy. And so the police officer said, look, this does not look like a murder plot to me. It just looks like your dad is doing something fairly responsible. And then as for the passport application paperwork where his dad had used a phony name, the police officer said, look, he has not filed this paperwork, and so it's not illegal what he's doing. Anybody can get some paperwork out and fill it in with whatever they want. it becomes illegal if they attempt to actually pass it off and submit the paperwork, and as far as we know, he hasn't done that. So that's weird, but it's not illegal. And so Part had to leave the police station, and he went back to the apartment and he told his mom what happened. And ultimately they decided that all they could do now was just wait and continue to watch that software that monitored Arun Kumar's computer and just hope Arun Kumar would do something that was incriminating that they could then bring to the police and say, see, he's trying to kill us, and collect a payout and flee the country. But over the next few days that Part and his mother every day just constantly checked this software and watched what Arun Kumar was doing on his computer, all they saw was Arun Kumar was using his computer to do work emails and really basic stuff, absolutely nothing incriminating. And in fact, over these few days, Arun Kumar would actually call Part's mom to ask her when she was coming back home again, and she would tell him that basically she was going to stay at Part's place indefinitely, and Arun Kumar did not seem upset or annoyed by this at all. If anything, it just seemed like he was really distracted and wasn't actually listening to Part's mom as she was speaking. And while this did seem kind of suspicious to Part and his mom, that basically Arun Kumar didn't care that his wife wasn't coming home anytime soon, it still wasn't incriminating. And so Part and his mom decided to just continue looking deeper and deeper into Arun Kumar's computer to see if there was anything that could begin to explain what was really going on here. And sure enough, Part dug deeper and deeper into Arun Kumar's computer, and he did discover something. Part began finding all these emails with people back in India that kind of vaguely indicated that Arun Kumar was involved in a very sketchy deal, like a business deal. Now, again, the emails were incredibly vague, but what was clear in these back and forths in these emails was that it seemed like Arun Kumar had gotten wrapped up with some really shady people, and they were having these really nasty exchanges in these emails about this, deal that Arun Kumar seemed to be involved in. And so Part began to wonder if maybe he and his mom had this all backwards, that he, his mom, and his sister were not the ones actually in danger here, that in fact, it was Arun Kumar who was in danger. Maybe because this deal, went south, and these people that he was doing this deal with, maybe they were mad at him. And so perhaps all these life insurance policies and this new fake identity were some sort of move by Arun Kumar to kind of flee the danger he was in. And so obviously, if this was true, this was still a horrible situation for their whole family, but it was markedly better than what Part and his mom had been operating on before, which was, that Arun Kumar was going to kill his whole family. And so pretty quickly, as a result of kind of thinking about this in a new way, Part's mother started feeling a lot better about the whole situation and actually left Part's apartment and went back to the house to go live with Arun Kumar. And Part himself began to think that, maybe this is not as big of a deal as we thought it was. I'm sure my dad will figure out whatever he needs to figure out here to get out of whatever mess he's in. And over the coming days, Part checked in with his mom every single day because now she's living with Arun Kumar and she said everything was fine. And Part, he continued to check his dad's computer activity and nothing else really popped up. It was still just the same stuff they had originally found. And so it just kind of seemed like, maybe this really is not as big of a deal as we thought it was. But on the morning of January 20th, 2008, so about 2.5 weeks after Part's mom showed up at his apartment, everything changed. On that morning, Part logged into his computer to check on his dad's computer using that software because he was still checking it every single day. And the first thing he saw was his dad had sent this email to this woman who Part didn't know, and this woman was certainly not his mother. And in this email, his dad told this person that he had a big contract coming up and he was going to make a ton of money from it. And then also at the end of this email, he told this woman that he loved her. And so right away, Part's thinking, okay, my dad is obviously having another affair because this is not my mom and he's saying he loves her. And also, what's my dad talking about with this big contract coming up? Is he talking about the insurance policies? Does he expect those to pay out soon, indicating that I, my sister, or my mom might be dead? And then also, the other thing that Part noticed that morning as he's checking through his dad's computer activity is he found another message his dad had sent out recently where he communicated to somebody that his father had died. So Part's grandfather had died. And also in this message, Arun Kumar is telling this person that he's going to go to his dad's funeral alone, that his wife and 2 kids were not invited to this funeral. And so Part's reading this, and he's totally devastated by the fact that his grandfather's dead, and the fact that, he's not being invited to the funeral? But again, he's thinking, oh my gosh, is that because my dad thinks I'm not going to be alive? Is this all connected, between the big contract and the fact that we're not going to be at the funeral? Is this my dad thinking he's going to enact this murder plot soon? Part didn't know, but he felt like he and his mom and his sister were running out of time, and he needed to act right now. And so Part got off his computer, he called his mom, and they made a plan. That evening, at around 9:15 p.m., Part got in his car and began driving towards his parents' house to go confront his dad. This was the plan he and his mom had come up with. Basically, his mom would stay at Part's apartment, and Part would go and tell his dad, we know about what you're doing, and you gotta stop. And even though Part was totally jacked up on adrenaline as he drove towards the house, he felt like he really had the upper hand going into whatever this confrontation was going to be. Because, number one, Part was showing up totally unannounced at night to his dad's place. His dad's going to be caught off guard when he sees him. And also, Part knew he was much physically bigger than his father. Part was over 6 feet tall and over 200 pounds, and so he had the physical angle as well. And so Part really felt confident driving towards the house that he was going to come out the victor in whatever ensued. At around 10:45 p.m., Part finally arrived in front of his parents' house. He parked the car, he got out, he walked up the front steps, and he knocked on the front door. And a couple of seconds later, Arun Kumar came to the door, he opened it up, and he's totally confused to see his son standing there. And then before Arun Kumar could do anything, Part, in his deepest and most authoritative voice, looked at his dad and said, "We need to talk." And then he intentionally bumped into his dad with his shoulder as he walked into the house. And so his dad is standing at the front door, not really sure what's going on. And Part, after taking a few steps in, he abruptly turns around. And so now he's looking back at his dad. And he takes a step forward and gets right in his dad's face and says, I know what you're up to. I know what you've done. And you have a simple choice to make. You can either stop what you're doing and become the family man you're supposed to be, faithful to mom, or I'm going to go to the police and tell them what you're up to, and you're going to go to jail. Either way, whatever you're doing stops right now. And for a moment, Part and Arun Kumar are basically staring at each other in silence, and then Arun Kumar, before Part could stop him, basically ran past Part, passed him down the hallway, and he ran into the master bedroom, disappearing from Part's view. And so Part's turned around, and he wasn't expecting this, and suddenly all that confidence he had going into this confrontation was gone. Because he's thinking, oh my goodness, my dad, maybe he's got a weapon in there. I need to get in there and stop him. And so Part, he turns and runs down the hallway. He darts into the bedroom, having no idea what he's going to see inside, but what he sees does catch him off guard. Arun Kumar is just sitting on the bed, doing nothing. He's just staring what looks like at the wall, and Part just stops in the doorway, looks at his dad, and then realizes his dad's not just absently staring at the wall, he's staring into the open bathroom. And in the open bathroom, on the ground, are all those tools left over from where his dad had been working on the sink and then never finished. Like, all these tools are scattered on the ground, including one tool that now Part is realizing his dad is looking directly at. It was a big, heavy metal pipe wrench. And suddenly Part realized, my dad is looking at a weapon, and he's considering whether or not to get that weapon and attack me with it. The next morning, Part's mother pulled up in front of the house that she shared with Arun Kumar. She walked up the steps, went to the front door, she opened it up, and as soon as she stepped inside, she yelled out, hello, who's here? But there was silence. And immediately, she got a bad feeling, but she knew she had to investigate. And so Part's mom began slowly walking down the hallway, the same hallway that Part and his dad had been fighting in the night before. And she went down the hallway, and she turned and looked into the master bedroom, and she couldn't believe what she saw. There was blood on the carpets, on the walls. It was a bloodbath, and in the middle of the room was an obvious dead body that was so mutilated and destroyed, she couldn't even identify it. And so seconds later, she had run outside and dialed 911. It would take police almost 4 years to finally untangle Arun Kumar's insane web of lies and also make an arrest for the murder that took place inside of that house. And the reason it took nearly 4 years is because nothing in this case was what it looked like. Now, Part and his mother had been correct about a number of things about Arun Kumar. For example, Arun Kumar was having another affair, he had taken out life insurance policies on his whole family, and he was looking to obtain a fake identity. They were also right that Arun Kumar had become embroiled in a very shady deal back in India, but the specifics of that deal were not what Part and Part's mom thought it was. And when Arun Kumar announced in that message that, his father had died and he'd be traveling to India all alone, that his wife and his kids weren't coming, they weren't invited, well, Part and his mom had been correct. that this was a cover. This was an excuse for Arun Kumar to put his big plan into action. And Arun Kumar's big plan did involve murder, and so Part and his mom were right about that aspect of his plan. However, Arun Kumar's target for this murder was not who Part and his mom thought it was. They were not the target. Arun Kumar was going to murder himself. Or more specifically, he was going to pretend to kill himself. That was actually the shady deal he was involved in back in India. He was working with people who could help him fake his own death. And so what he was going to do is go to India, fake his death, and then once he was dead on paper, that would trigger an insurance payout of his own life insurance policy, and that money would go to his wife and his kids, and then Arun Kumar would disappear using his fake identity he would have, along with his mistress, the woman he was having an affair with. That was the person he had sent that email to talking about the big payout. But Part and Part's mom did not know this last critical piece of Arun Kumar's plan. They really believed they were the target of this big plot, that they were going to get killed. And so that's why they felt like they had to act first. So on January 20th, 2008, Part and his mother worked out an alibi for themselves. What they were going to tell people is that at around 8 p.m., Part went and picked up his mother from the house that she shared with Arun Kumar, and the two of them just went back to Part's apartment, and that was it. But in reality, Part never went over and picked his mom up and brought her back to the apartment. Instead, she was at the house with Arun Kumar when Part showed up at 10:45 p.m. to confront Arun Kumar. So it was him and his mom at the house as Part is demanding Arun Kumar come clean and stop what he's doing. And then at some point during this heated argument in the hallway, Arun Kumar turned and ran into the bedroom, and Part chased after him. And Part, he sees Arun Kumar sitting on the edge of the bed, and he thinks his dad is looking at the pipe wrench on the floor in the bathroom. And Part thinks, my dad is about to get that wrench and attack me with it. And so Part just acted first, and he ran and grabbed that wrench, and he beat his father to death with it. And then after leaving his father's unrecognizable, mutilated body just lumped in the middle of the bedroom floor, blood all over the walls, he and his mother just left the house and went back to Part's apartment. And then the next day, Part's mom went back to the house, and she pretended to find Arun Kumar's body, even though she already knew he was in there. And then she called 911 and acted totally beside herself when they showed up, as if she had just happened upon her husband's dead body. But almost 4 years later, when the truth finally came out about this horrible situation, Part and his mother were arrested. Now, both of them absolutely maintained that they genuinely believed their lives were in danger because of Arun Kumar, and they said during that confrontation in the house, Part was only acting in self-defense. He really believed his dad was going to grab that pipe wrench first, and so he had to do it before him, and that's why he killed his dad. But ultimately, Part would plead guilty to manslaughter, and he would be sentenced to 33 months in prison, and Part's mother would plead guilty to conspiracy, and she would be sentenced to 10 months in prison.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the MrBallen Podcast, as well as MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.
One night, in the winter of 1958, a pregnant young woman was getting ready for bed when she heard a sudden loud knock at her front door. She walked out of the bathroom and looked across the room to the glass sliding door that led to the front of her property, and immediately she was disappointed at who she saw standing there. But regardless, she pulled her robe tight around her and walked over to see what they wanted. Minutes later, one of the worst crimes in California history would be committed. And at the end of the trial, more history would be made when the judge handed down a sentence that was so harsh, it has yet to be repeated in the state of California. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please replace all of the Amazon Music follow button's clothes with the exact same clothes, but 3 sizes smaller. Okay, let's get into today's story. The year was 1957, and Olga Nettie-Kopensik was about to leave her home in Vancouver, Canada, and make the 1,400-mile trip south to the west coast of the United States. Carefully folding her clean white uniforms into her suitcase, the 29-year-old surgical nurse felt thrilled just thinking about the new job that awaited her at Cottage Hospital in Santa Barbara. Because for Olga, getting this job was a dream come true. Ever since Olga could remember, from the time she was a teenager growing up in the tiny town of Benito, Manitoba, one of Canada's western provinces, she had wanted to do something meaningful with her life, something that would help people in practical ways. And after graduating from high school and working in a doctor's office, Olga had decided what that something was. She wanted to become a nurse. So, 6 years earlier, back in 1951, Olga took the plunge. She had packed up these very same bags that she was using again now and headed to the highly regarded nursing school at British Columbia's General Hospital in Vancouver. It had been a trip of 1,200 miles, almost as long as the journey she'd be making the next day when she left for California. Even all these years later, she still remembered how homesick she felt after leaving Benito. She remembered waving goodbye to her parents and her younger brother and sister, and seeing her father, who had worked for 34 years as a foreman for the National Canadian Railroads, look so proud and so sad as she climbed onto the train that would take her off to school. And now, as Olga thought about all the additional miles she'd be putting between herself and her family with this move to California, she suddenly felt a fresh wave of that same homesickness. But Olga was not someone who let herself dwell for very long on her own problems. Taking a break from her packing, the small and slim woman with curly auburn hair, hazel eyes, and a quick smile sat down for a few minutes on her bed and tried to collect her thoughts. She reminded herself that she and her family would be exchanging letters, and that once she settled in Santa Barbara, she might be able to persuade her parents to come down to California and visit her, and maybe see a little bit of the United States. In the meantime, they would keep Olga up to date on all the news she loved to hear the most, all about what was happening in her hometown and the arrival of any new children in the family. And looking around now at her clean, bare bedroom, Olga also reminded herself that this was the moment she had worked so hard to achieve. Her graduation from nursing school and getting her surgical nursing certificate had been one of the best moments of Olga's entire life. When she closed her eyes, she could still practically smell the huge bouquet of fresh flowers she had carried with her on graduation day. And she could still recall how complete she felt wearing her new crisp white cap that was an emblem of her new profession. Taking a deep breath, Olga stood up from her bed and reached for the last pile of her skirts and slacks, and as she did, she felt all her excitement return to her in a rush. A few minutes later, the young nurse, affectionately known at Vancouver General Hospital as Ollie, gave a last look around and then hurried out of her room to say goodbye to her friends and fellow classmates. A few weeks later, in the fall of 1957, Olga reported for duty at Cottage Hospital in Santa Barbara, California. Ever since arriving a few days earlier and getting settled into her new apartment, Olga had spent hours just drinking in the sights and sounds of her new home. A beautiful gem of a city right on the central coast, tucked between the Pacific Ocean and the steep Santa Ynez Mountains. And Olga's impressions of her new hospital job were every bit as positive as her impressions of the city of Santa Barbara. From the moment Olga had walked through the doors of Cottage Hospital, the young Canadian nurse became known for how competent and conscientious she was while she was in the operating room, and for her ability to care for patients who had come through life and death crises. But along with the professionalism that made Olga a favorite among the doctors and supervising nurses, Olga's personality also made her a favorite among her coworkers, who would often stop by Olga's apartment after work to swap stories and Cottage Hospital gossip. And Olga would not be at work long at Cottage Hospital before she had her own exciting news to share with her friends. Because early in November, just a few months after stepping off the train that had taken her from Vancouver to California, Olga had met the young Santa Barbara lawyer who would later become her husband. Like most patients and family of patients who find themselves in a hospital, 28-year-old Frank Duncan had arrived at Cottage Hospital early in the morning of November 7, 1957, because of a medical emergency. Frank was there because his mother, Elizabeth Duncan, known as Betty, had overdosed on sleeping pills, and Olga was one of the nurses assigned to care for her. Although Betty Duncan would make a full recovery, she remained in a coma with Frank at her side for nearly 4 days. And during that time, Frank and Olga wound up seeing a lot of each other. And it wasn't long before the criminal defense attorney and the surgical nurse fell into the habit of talking to one another about their personal lives. Olga told Frank about the tiny town where she grew up, in a province that was almost twice the size of the whole state of California, but with a lot fewer people. And Frank told Olga his very different story about growing up in several apartments and households as he followed his mother, Betty, through a series of marriages and divorces before the two of them had arrived here in Santa Barbara just 2 years earlier. But despite their differences, Olga and Frank also had a lot in common. Like Olga, Frank was a hard worker who had held down 2 and 3 jobs in order to put himself through law school in San Francisco while also helping to support his mother. Betty's marriages had produced 6 children, but not a lot of savings. And now, at the age of 53, Frank's mother had felt alone and financially dependent on Frank and his comfortable income. In fact, as Frank told Olga, it had been the prospect of living by herself after her latest marriage ended that had driven Frank's mom to attempt suicide via the sleeping pill overdose. Olga was horrified, and she could also relate to Frank's terrible sense of guilt over his mother's feelings of desperation and abandonment. Because to both Olga and Frank, family obligation was not just an idea, it was at the very heart of who they were. By the time Frank's mother was well enough to leave the hospital, Frank had settled it so that Betty would come back to his apartment and live with him. When Betty was finally discharged, Frank thanked Olga for all her help and support, but when Frank left Cottage Hospital, gently guiding Betty out the door and toward the parking lot, Olga felt a sudden pang of regret. She had liked Frank, liked his dark wavy hair, his intelligent eyes behind his horn-rimmed glasses, and she liked the way he talked, with just the slightest lisp that made his S's and Z's sound like a TH sound. But Olga did not have to miss Frank for very long. It would turn out that Frank felt the same attraction to Olga that she felt for him. And by January, 2 months after the pair had first met, they were dating, getting together at least 3 or 4 times a week. And it wasn't long after that Frank had fallen in love with Olga, and Olga was telling her coworkers at Cottage Hospital, as well as her family, that she was pretty sure she had just found Mr. Right. And sure enough, 5 months later, on the beautiful morning of Friday, June 20th, 1958, Olga and Frank walked together hand in hand down to the famous Santa Barbara courthouse, where they were married in a ceremony performed by a superior court judge. The simple service was just what they had wanted it to be. Just the two of them, no expensive or elaborate wedding, and no family having to undertake the hours and expense of traveling from Olga's home in Manitoba to the central California coast. But it did not take long before Olga and Frank's marriage started showing signs of serious trouble. As soon as Frank moved out from living with his mother to go live in an apartment of his own with Olga, both Frank and Olga became acutely aware of just how tightly Frank's mother, Betty Duncan, wanted to fasten her apron strings around her favorite and most financially successful child. It apparently wasn't enough that Betty was still able to stay in Frank's old apartment despite him leaving. What Betty really seemed to want was unlimited access to Frank's time and attention. And when Olga discovered, not long after she and Frank were married, that she was pregnant, things only got worse. Betty never missed out on an opportunity to talk negatively about her new daughter-in-law, even suggesting to Frank that Frank was not the father of Olga's baby. While Frank did his best to persuade Olga that his mother's hostility would eventually disappear as soon as her grandchild was actually born, for Olga, the only silver lining in the situation was the fact that she hardly ever saw Frank's mother in person. Betty may have wanted her son, Frank, to spend all of his free time in the apartment with her, but Frank put in long days at work, and Betty had her own busy and active social life. Always carefully dressed and groomed and wearing stylish glasses with frames that tilted up at the outside edges, Betty was a regular at the courthouse where Frank tried his cases. But Betty and her closest friend and constant companion, an 84-year-old woman named Emma Short, also made the rounds of local businesses and clothing stores, as well as lunch spots like the Woolworth's department store and the Tropical Cafe and Bar in downtown Santa Barbara. Neither woman had their driver's license, so the two of them had become a very familiar sight on the city bus routes, with Betty always leading the way and making the decisions about where the two of them should go and what they should do. So even though Betty's routine included calling Olga and Frank, or just Frank, to complain about being ignored, or to describe Olga as a, quote, foreigner who had trapped poor Frank into marriage, it was only Frank that Betty actually wanted to see. Still, it wasn't long before Olga was almost as annoyed as Betty was with Frank, because now, in an effort to keep all the women in his life happy, Frank was shuttling back and forth between the apartment where he lived with Olga and the apartment he had once shared with his mother. Meanwhile, rumors about the couple's troubled marriage had started to swirl among Olga's coworkers and among Betty's friends. And so, just 2 months after Frank and Olga had walked into that courtroom in Santa Barbara to get married, the couple walked into another courthouse in Ventura, California, 27 miles to the south of Santa Barbara, and signed the legal documents that confirmed that their marriage was now officially over. Based on the complaint that the couple presented to the court that the two were not living together, in the eyes of the law, it was now like the marriage had never existed in the first place. But even though this annulment was welcome news to Betty Duncan, it did not mark the end of the relationship between her son, Frank, and Olga. By the time Olga was almost 7 months pregnant, she was in an apartment that Frank had found for her at a place called Garden Street Apartments, located 3 miles from Cottage Hospital. And at least a few times a month, Frank would stop by to eat dinners with Olga and sometimes stay late into the night. Unlike Frank, Olga did not believe that Betty would ever have welcomed Olga or her baby into the Duncan family. But whatever happened, Olga still wanted Frank to be a part of their child's life. In her letters back home to family in Manitoba, Canada, Olga would tell her parents that Frank still had a lot of growing up to do. But if her family really wanted to help her, they could do that just by telling her their news about home and the children. Even though Olga's marriage had not worked out, her attitude was upbeat. She was thrilled that she was going to become a mother, and even though Frank had been a disappointment as a husband, Olga had a close circle of friends and a job that she loved. As she began seeing less and less of Frank, Olga instead spent her time concentrating on her work at Cottage Hospital and on making plans for 2 months in the future when her baby was due to arrive, and when Olga's own mother would be coming to visit and help Olga with her newborn. But even as Olga was adjusting to a life without Frank, which is just what Frank's mother had hoped would happen, Betty started having problems of her own. And these were problems she did not want to share with her son. As a criminal attorney, Frank often represented clients who were guilty. And despite his best efforts to keep them out of jail, some of those clients still wound up behind bars. And to Betty's horror, on November 12th, 6 months after Frank and Olga had gotten married, and 4 months after that marriage had been annulled, Betty had become the target of an extortion scheme related to one of Frank's clients. The wife of one of Frank's clients, who wound up going to jail, had approached Betty while she was eating lunch with her best friend Emma at the Tropical Cafe. This woman, Esperanza Esquivel, walked right up to Betty and promptly accused her son, Frank, of charging Mrs. Esquivel's husband, Frank's client, who happened to be the owner of the Tropical Cafe, too much in legal fees. And now Esperanza demanded that money, $500, back. And if Betty went to Frank or the police about this extortion threat, then Esperanza said she knew two men who would hurt or kill the one person Betty loved most in the world, her son Frank. And for Betty, this threat was so terrifying that she did not hesitate to comply. Within days, she had cashed a check Frank had given her to make a down payment on a new typewriter, and instead of making the down payment, Betty handed the $150 over to Esperanza's so-called enforcers. But before Betty could even figure out a way to come up with the remaining $350 that Esperanza had demanded, one of the men Esperanza had hired to collect the money, or they would hurt Frank, had made a new and much bigger demand. And suddenly, Betty Duncan started wondering exactly what it was that she had gotten herself involved in. On Monday, November 17th, 5 days after Betty's meeting with Esperanza Esquivel, Olga arrived for work at Cottage Hospital just as she always did, right on time with her white uniform neatly starched and her cap pinned securely to her hair. Even though she was 7 months pregnant, she was as active and busy in the operating room and tending to patients as she had been the very first day she'd arrived 1 year earlier. The only difference now was that Olga, on one of her recent visits to her obstetrician, had been diagnosed with an inflammation of the nerves in one of her hands that caused a loss of feeling in her fingertips. But other than that, the baby doctor had given Olga a clean bill of health, assuring Olga that the weepy feelings that sometimes came over her were nothing to worry about. And just as Olga's pregnancy had not interfered with her work, it had also not interfered with Olga's modest but important social life. So at the end of that workday on Monday, Olga invited her two friends and coworkers, Doreen and Sylvia, back to Olga's apartment, Unit 11 at 114 Garden Street, so she could show them the gown that she was making for her unborn baby. But what was supposed to be a short visit and a light meal of hot buns and coffee soon turned into an entire evening of talking and laughing among the friends. And by the time Doreen and Sylvia had called out their final goodbyes to Olga and piled into a taxicab to head off to their own apartments, it was almost 11 p.m. Smiling, Olga had listened to the last of her friends' laughter before the door of the taxi shut and the car engine revved as the taxi pulled away from the curb. Before her friends had left, Olga had changed out of her work clothes and into her comfortable pink and white quilted bathrobe. Now, standing at her open front entrance, Olga thought about her baby's father. The last time Frank had stopped by to see her was 10 days earlier on November 7th, his 29th birthday. Sighing, Olga stepped back and closed and locked the glass door. She was so preoccupied that she barely heard the sound of another car with a loud engine slowly driving down the street outside the front of Garden Apartments. Still thinking about Frank, she could hardly believe that it was only a year ago that they had first met in Cottage Hospital at the bedside of Frank's mother. When Olga's obstetrician had recently suggested that Olga's weepiness might be caused by temporary depression, she knew he was right. Because even after everything that had happened, Olga still loved the man she had once married. But just as she had written to her mother and father 5 days earlier in her last letter home, Olga also knew that life was short, and she was determined to enjoy the rest of it with or without Frank Duncan. And putting Frank out of her mind, Olga turned her thoughts to her mother's upcoming visit, which was planned to begin in just 6 weeks. Olga couldn't wait to see her mother's face when she stepped down from the train and got her first good look at Olga's new home. She knew how much her mother would love Santa Barbara, with its landscape of Spanish-style architecture and red clay tile roofs, and the streets and lawns dotted with palm trees, and once again, Olga thought about how lucky she was just to be there. With that thought in mind, Olga headed to her bathroom to brush her teeth and hang up her robe before turning out the lights and going to bed. But before Olga had even picked up her toothbrush, she was startled by a sudden and very loud knock on the front door of her apartment. Putting her toothbrush back down on the sink counter and pulling her robe even more tightly around her, Olga stepped back into her bedroom. After a moment's hesitation and wondering if maybe this was Frank, Olga ran her fingers through her auburn curls, then walked in the direction of her unexpected visitor. The next day, on Tuesday, November 18th, 1958, Olga Duncan, who was scheduled to assist in a morning surgery, did not report to work at Cottage Hospital. She also wasn't answering her phone. This was so completely unlike Olga, who had not missed a single day of work despite being pregnant, and despite all the upheavals in her personal life, that two of her coworkers left the hospital right away to go to Olga's apartment just to make sure that she was okay. But instead of finding that Olga had just overslept, which is what they told each other must have happened, when they got to Garden Apartments, they found the sliding glass door of Olga's apartment open. And inside of her apartment, they could see that the lights were on and the bed had been turned back, but it had not been slept in. The neat pile of baby clothes was exactly where Olga had left it, folded up on the couch, and sitting on her dresser was the purse that Olga never failed to carry with her anytime she left her apartment. And Olga's friends weren't the only people standing next to the open glass door of Olga's apartment, trying to make sense of a situation that was suddenly starting to appear very scary and suspicious. Joining them was the apartment manager, Dorothy Barnett, whose eyes, behind her rhinestone-trimmed glasses, were filled with worry and concern. Dorothy had always had a soft spot for her young Canadian tenant and had often referred to Olga as a lovely girl. Olga had always been friendly, quiet, and never late with her rent, just the kind of person that the older landlady would have liked to see in every one of her units. A few minutes later, Frank Duncan would get an urgent call from his office. According to Frank's secretary, it was a woman named Dorothy Barnett, and she was calling to inform Mr. Duncan that Olga had disappeared. Frank received this message while he was in court, representing a client named Marciano Esquivel. Stepping away from the courtroom as soon as he could, Frank called the Santa Barbara police station to report that his wife, Olga Duncan, was missing. What Frank did not know, as he returned to the courtroom, was that Marciano Esquivel's wife, Esperanza, had very recently extorted money from Frank's mother, Betty Duncan. At the police station, the officer who took Frank's call had asked Frank what he knew or thought of Olga's apparent disappearance. Unlike Dorothy Barnett and Olga's two hospital co-workers, Frank was concerned, but not alarmed. According to Frank, Olga had been angry with Frank, and that's why she might have left. Or maybe she had decided to go back to her hometown in Manitoba, Canada, and pay a visit to her parents and family. So it wasn't until November 20th, 2 days later, when there was still no sign of Olga, that police issued a missing persons bulletin and assigned a detective to investigate. Over the next 3 weeks, several different officers from the Santa Barbara Police Department would follow up on a variety of tips and leads in their search for Olga Duncan. But it was during the first 72 hours that police developed their initial theory of the case. Based on their examination of Olga's apartment and the interviews with the nurses who had visited with Olga the night before she disappeared, police quickly decided that Olga must have somehow been taken from her apartment against her will. This was based on the fact that she had not made any plans to visit family or friends in Canada or anywhere else that police were aware of, and Olga had left behind all the documents and belongings that people would normally carry with them on any kind of trip. In addition to leaving her purse on top of her dresser, she also left behind all of her luggage, her passport, and her driver's license. And then there was the witness statement that Olga's landlady provided to the police. According to Dorothy, after she heard Olga's friends leaving Olga's apartment at about 11 p.m. on the night of Monday, November 17th, Dorothy reported hearing footsteps on the stairs outside of her own bedroom window. At the time, she believed she was hearing one of her neighbors, but the next day, when Olga was gone, those neighbors told Dorothy, no, they had not been walking outside late the night before. The police also ruled out 2 other possible scenarios. Since nothing of value seemed to be missing from Olga's apartment, it did not seem likely that this was some kind of robbery gone wrong. They also ruled out any connection between Olga's disappearance and reports from several days earlier about a man or men who had harassed 2 teenage girls in towns outside of Santa Barbara. Instead, the one person police were most interested in speaking with was Frank Duncan, the father of Olga's unborn baby. Even though Frank and his mother Betty both had alibis for the night that Olga disappeared, they spent that evening together watching TV, police were very curious about the role that Frank and Betty had played in Olga's life. especially when Frank himself would eventually admit to police that even after separating from Olga, he continued to visit her, a fact that Frank had tried to hide from his mother. But, much to the surprise of local detectives, it was not Olga's disappearance that brought Frank and Betty into the Santa Barbara police station on November 22nd, 4 days after Olga went missing. Instead, it was a totally different criminal matter. In response to questions from Frank about what had become of the money Frank had given Betty so she could make a down payment on the typewriter Frank wanted to buy, Frank's mother had finally told Frank about the extortion demands from Esperanza Esquivel. Outraged over the threats that the Esquivels had made to his mother, that unless she paid them back the legal fees he had charged them, they would physically harm Frank, Frank dragged his mother off to the police station to file a formal complaint against Esperanza and her 2 enforcers, charging them with extortion and blackmail. Betty explained to police that she had given one of Esperanza's enforcers $150, but now they had bumped up their demand from a total of $500 to $2,000. And unless police could find and jail Esperanza's enforcers, Betty was worried that she and Frank would never be safe, especially since Betty had never gotten a close enough look at the men's faces to be able to recognize and identify them. What puzzled the police was that Frank did not seem at all worried about whether Olga's life might also be in danger. If these extortionists or blackmailers or whoever they were would harm the attorney and his mother, why would they ignore the mother of Frank's unborn baby? But without any hard evidence to connect Olga's disappearance to the extortion scheme, and without a description from Betty about what these enforcers looked like, all police could do was set up phone taps on Frank's and Betty's home telephones in case the extortionists tried to contact Betty or Frank by phone. Meanwhile, by the end of November, so roughly 2 weeks since Olga's disappearance, the key figures in the investigation had already started to move on with their lives. Betty was still working with Santa Barbara police, looking at mugshots of potential suspects in her extortion case, but still not able to make any positive IDs. Due to the publicity surrounding Olga's disappearance, Frank had left Betty and Santa Barbara and moved 95 miles south to Los Angeles to look for a new job. And by December 10th, not only had Frank found work, he was also spotted stepping out on a date with a new, attractive woman he'd met in San Francisco. But on December 12th, 3 weeks after Olga's disappearance, and 2 weeks after Betty had told police about her blackmailers, Olga's disappearance would once again take center stage in Frank and Betty's lives. That's when 30-year-old Santa Barbara detective Charles Thompson literally stumbled on the information that would break the mystery of what happened to Olga wide open. Only recently assigned to the extortion and missing person cases, Detective Thompson had decided to re-interview friends and acquaintances of Olga, Frank, and Betty. And while going over the statement of one of the very minor players in both cases, Detective Thompson listened in disbelief as this very unlikely source let slip a piece of information that would change everything police knew or thought about Olga's disappearance. On the following day, Saturday, December 13th, the Santa Barbara police made their first arrest. And on Sunday, December 21st, so 1 month and 4 days after Olga's disappearance, 3 Santa Barbara detectives were standing next to their parked police car at the edge of Casitas Pass Road, 17 miles south of Santa Barbara and just over the line into Ventura County. In front of them was a narrow, steep-sided gully that sloped about 20 feet down from the deserted 2-lane highway. Leaning a little bit forward, the officers could just make out the end of a corrugated metal drainage pipe that ran side to side directly under the road where they had parked their car. Standing next to the detectives was the passenger who had come with them from the Santa Barbara police station. After a few moments of looking, the passenger raised their hand and pointed to a shallow depression just in front of the end of the metal drainage pipe. A few minutes later, the passenger was back inside the car, while the 3 detectives, carrying the shovel that they had stowed in the car trunk, were slipping and sliding their way down to the bottom of the pit. Based on the information that passenger had provided to Santa Barbara police, along with the information gathered by Detective Thompson 9 days earlier, here is a reconstruction of what really happened to Olga Duncan almost 5 weeks earlier on the night of Monday, November 17th, and early in the morning of Tuesday, November 18th. After Olga said goodbye to her friends at about 11 p.m. on that Monday night, she didn't notice that the car with the loud engine that she'd heard coming down the street had actually stopped right outside of her apartment building. Olga had been so busy thinking about her baby, about Frank, and then about her mother's upcoming visit to Santa Barbara that the sudden silence as the driver turned off the car engine did not even register. And neither did the sound of quiet footsteps as the person inside of that car got out and walked up the stairs to the sliding glass door of Olga's apartment. The first Olga knew about the arrival of her surprise visitor was the sound of urgent knocking on her front door. And when she stepped out of her bedroom to see who it was, her first feeling was just disappointment. Even through the drapes that covered the door, she could tell that the shadowy figure outside was not Frank. But that feeling of disappointment immediately turned to concern when she heard a voice telling her that something was wrong with Frank, and Frank needed Olga's help. Still dressed in her pink and white quilted robe and house slippers, Olga opened the door just wide enough to have a conversation. She did not invite her visitor in, but once Olga had heard that Frank was actually sitting in a car right outside and that he was very, very drunk, Olga agreed to go downstairs and check on him. A moment later, Olga had stepped out of her apartment, not even bothering to turn out the lights or pull the door closed all the way behind her. A minute later, Olga was on the street, leaning down to look through the front car window at a man huddled in the passenger seat. But even as Olga realized that this man was not Frank Duncan, it was too late. The next thing she knew, there was an explosion of pain in her head as the man behind her brought the butt of a .22 caliber pistol down on the back of Olga's skull. Even as Olga's attacker yanked open the back door of the car and started pushing Olga inside, the man who had been slumped in the front seat had turned around so he could help pull the unconscious nurse onto the back seat of the gray 1948 Chevy. Moments later, Olga's first attacker had run around the car and slipped behind the wheel into the driver's seat, while his partner in the passenger seat sat up straight and looked around to make sure there was no one watching them. Then, with a grinding of gears, the old Chevy pulled away from the curb to begin the 230-mile trip from Santa Barbara south to Tijuana, Mexico. For the two young men in the front seats of the car, there was nothing personal about this kidnapping or about what they planned to do with Olga once they reached Mexico. Instead, this was an opportunity of a lifetime. They'd been promised $6,000 for making Olga disappear, an amount of money that today would be worth more than $31,000 for each of them. But almost as soon as they had left Garden Apartments, the men's carefully laid plans for how to kill Olga Duncan started to fall apart. They had not even made it out of Santa Barbara before Olga had regained consciousness and began struggling and screaming for help. Pulling off the main road and parking the car along a track to a deserted beach, both men got out and opened the rear passenger doors. Leaning in over their struggling and terrified kidnap victim, one of the men held Olga down while the other started hitting her head again and again with the butt of his gun, using so much force that the pistol actually broke. Once Olga was finally still, with blood now pouring out of her head into the car seat right under her, the men used the tape they'd brought with them to bind Olga's hands and feet before they got back into the front seats and began heading once again for the main road south. But the kidnappers had only driven 13 more miles before they started to have car trouble. And instead of driving to Mexico, they were forced to get rid of Olga's body somewhere much closer to home. Turning onto rural Highway 33 South out of Santa Barbara, they headed through the mountains toward a very small town in Ventura County. And along the way, on Casitas Pass Road, the two men found exactly the spot they were looking for. Pulling the car over to the side of the road, they killed the engine and then got out to look down at a steep-sided gully 20 feet below the road and at the opening of the drainage pipe that ran crossways underneath the road where they were standing. A few minutes later, sometime after 1 a.m. in the morning of Tuesday, November 18th, the two men dragged Olga's body out of the car and down the side of the ravine to a slight depression in front of the outflow pipe. Since their gun was now broken and would not fire, the two men took turns beating and then strangling Olga. When they were sure that the young mother-to-be was dead, they used their hands to dig a shallow grave, then rolled Olga over until she lay inside the hole. After covering Olga with dirt and gravel, the two men climbed out of the gully, hopped back into the 1948 Chevy they had rented the evening before for $25, and drove back to Santa Barbara. After getting rid of their bloody clothes and cleaning Olga's blood off the back seat before returning their rented car, the two murderers were ready to collect their paychecks. So, later that same morning, 20-year-old Luis Moya and 25-year-old Augustine Baldonado picked up the phone and called their employer, Betty Duncan, to tell her that the daughter-in-law she had hated so much was now dead, along with Frank's unborn child. It would turn out that Betty Duncan was so possessive of her beloved son Frank that when Frank met and fell in love with Olga at Cottage Hospital back in November of 1957, Betty was out of her mind with jealousy. From the moment Frank started dating Olga, Betty had done everything she could to break up the romance, calling Olga at least once a day for more than 3 months to threaten and insult the young woman and to scream at her to leave her son Frank alone. But it wasn't until Frank and Olga snuck off to be married at a civil service in June of 1958, by which time Olga was already pregnant, that Betty moved her hate campaign into high gear. On the couple's wedding night, Betty, who had found out about the marriage from a switchboard operator at Cottage Hospital, showed up at the apartment that Frank and Olga had rented and demanded that Frank come back to the apartment he shared with his mother. But even though Frank agreed to do just that, he refused to break all of his ties to Olga. So, 2 months later, on August 7th, Betty decided to take steps of her own to legally end the marriage, using the same skills at deceit and lying that had allowed Betty to marry and divorce 11 times and con most of her unsuspecting spouses out of some or all of their money. Betty paid an odd-job worker from the local Salvation Army $60 to go with her to Ventura Courthouse. Once there, the two of them actually managed to impersonate Frank and Olga and get Frank's marriage annulled. After faking that annulment, Betty started working on a more ambitious plan, permanently erasing her son's wife from the face of the earth. And over the next 4 months, Betty would approach 5 different people to see if they would kill Olga. All of them declined until Esperanza Esquivel put Betty in touch with 2 small-time criminals, Luis Moya and Augustine Baldonado, who agreed on a price of $6,000 for murdering Olga Duncan. What the killers did not know was that Betty had never intended to pay them $6,000. Instead, after making a down payment of $150 using Frank's typewriter money, Betty was already busy making up a story in which she was the innocent victim of extortion and her 2 hired guns would be the blackmailers she would later report to the Santa Barbara police. It wasn't until December 12, 1958, 3 weeks after Olga's murder, that Betty's best friend and constant companion, 84-year-old Emma Short, would tell Detective Charles Thompson about Betty impersonating Olga in order to get Frank's marriage annulled. Emma would also talk to police about Betty's hatred for Olga and Betty's various plots to get her daughter-in-law murdered. 1 day later, on December 13th, police arrested Betty Duncan for forgery and filing false legal papers in order to get her son's marriage annulled. And once Betty was in jail and police began investigating the information they'd gotten from Emma Short, it would only take 2 more weeks before police had also arrested Olga's killers. On Sunday, December 21st, Augustine Baldonado confessed to murder and described to police what had happened on the night that Olga was kidnapped. Then, Augustine agreed to lead the 3 Santa Barbara detectives to Casitas Pass Road, where Augustine and Luis had buried Olga's body. But it was not until the Ventura County Medical Examiner completed an autopsy on Olga Duncan that the police and the public would understand the full horror of what had happened to the young nurse from Canada whose baby girl was due to be born in less than 2 months. It would turn out that despite being beaten, pistol-whipped, and strangled, Olga Duncan was still alive when Augustine Baldonado and Luis Moya rolled her body into that shallow grave. In the end, the cause of Olga's death was suffocation, and her final breaths were lungfuls of dirt and gravel. On March 17, 1959, after what newspapers described as California's trial of the decade, Elizabeth Betty Duncan, Luis Moya, and Augustine Baldonado were all found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to death. 3.5 years later, on August 7, 1962, Luis and Augustine stepped into the same gas chamber at San Quentin prison where they were strapped into adjoining wooden chairs and executed. The next day, on August 8, 1962, at 10 in the morning, Betty Duncan was executed alone in the same gas chamber, the last woman ever to be executed in the state of California. Betty Duncan's last words were, "Where's Frank?" On December 30th, 1958, 9 days after the discovery of Olga's body and just over 1 year after the young nurse met Frank and Betty Duncan, Frank arranged a small service in memory of his murdered wife. Weeks later, Frank finally agreed to release Olga's cremated remains and send them back to her parents in Benito, Manitoba. Frank would go on to marry 2 more times. He would also go on to build a successful law practice in Los Angeles. Even though Frank defended his mother to the very end, after her execution, Frank refused to answer any questions about his mother's trial or the murder of his wife, Olga Duncan. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please replace all of the Amazon Music follow buttons clothes with the exact same clothes, but 3 sizes smaller. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. To check out our merchandise, to join our Discord server, or see what announcements are coming out of our studio, head on over to our brand new website, ballenstudios.com. So that's gonna do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.